Daniel Dukes always seemed to have an issue with respecting boundaries. He was not a malicious person, but he had this incredibly strange quirk where he simply did not believe that rules or walls applied to him. If he wanted to go somewhere or if he wanted to see something, he would just go and do it, completely ignoring the potential consequences or the impact it might have on other people. In the spring of 1996, when Daniel was 24 years old, he became absolutely obsessed with a computer game series called Ultima. Back in the early days of personal computer gaming, Ultima was a massive hit. It was this huge, open-world, role-playing fantasy game that captured the imaginations of millions of people around the world, and Daniel was one of those people who became completely consumed by it. He played it for hours and hours every single day, and eventually his obsession shifted from the game itself to the man who had actually created it. Daniel decided that he needed to meet this creator in person. He did some digging, figured out exactly what city the creator lived in, and then managed to track down his actual home address. One night, in the middle of the night, Daniel walked up to this man's house. He stood on the front porch and knocked on the door, expecting the creator to just open up, welcome him inside, and strike up a conversation. But of course, it was the middle of the night, and nobody answered the door. Most people would have taken the hint, realized how inappropriate it was to knock on a stranger's door at that hour, and gone home. But Daniel did not see things that way. He got incredibly frustrated that the creator was not answering the door, so he walked away for a little while to let his frustration cool down. But a couple of hours later, he came right back to the house. This time, he decided he was not going to let a locked door stand in his way. He walked around the side of the house, found a window, broke the glass, and climbed right inside. Once he was inside, he did not steal anything, and he did not look for any valuables. Instead, he just wandered upstairs, found one of the guest bedrooms, climbed into the bed, pulled the covers over himself, and fell fast asleep. The next morning, the creator of the game woke up, walked down the hallway, and opened the door to the bedroom. He was absolutely shocked to find this random stranger, Daniel, sleeping soundly in his bed. The creator immediately began screaming at Daniel, telling him to get out of his house right now. But Daniel was completely unfazed by the shouting. He just looked at the creator and told him that he wanted to keep sleeping in the bed. He was so calm and casual about it, which only made the creator more upset. Realizing he could not reason with this intruder, the creator called the police. When the police officers arrived, they found Daniel still lying in the bed, completely relaxed. They had to physically haul him out of the bed, pull him out of the house, and place him under arrest for breaking and entering and criminal trespassing. But this arrest did not do anything to change Daniel's behavior. Just 1 year later, in 1997, Daniel would find himself in trouble with the law again for the exact same issue of ignoring boundaries. This time, he was in Orlando, Florida, and he had decided to go to SeaWorld. After the park had closed for the night and all of the guests and staff had gone home, Daniel snuck onto the property. He wandered around the dark, empty park until he came across the manatee exhibit. He looked at the manatees swimming around in the water, and instead of just watching them, he decided he wanted to get in the water with them. So he stripped down and jumped into the exhibit, spending the night swimming around and playing with the manatees. When security finally found him, they called the police, and Daniel was arrested once again for trespassing. But despite his growing criminal history, the people who actually knew Daniel described him as being far from a hardened criminal. They said he was actually a very gentle, quiet, pot-smoking hippie who just adored animals and wanted to be close to them. He did not want to hurt anyone, and he did not want to steal anything. He just wanted to experience things on his own terms without any boundaries. In 1999, when Daniel was 27 years old, he joined a small religious community of people who practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. The devotees are well known for repeating their chant, Hare Krishna, over and over again as a form of meditation. Daniel moved into the community temple, but during his stay there, he basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He did not really practice the religion, and he did not help the other members with the daily chores like cleaning the temple or preparing the communal meals. Instead, Daniel spent virtually all of his time sitting in the temple's garden, feeding the wild birds that came to roost there. He became completely obsessed with these birds. He even kept a detailed notebook where he diligently tracked every single bird that entered the garden. He would write down what species they were, what they looked like, how much food he had given them, and how they behaved. To Daniel, these birds were the only thing that mattered. After about a month of living this way, Daniel abruptly walked up to the other worshippers in the temple and announced that he was going to be taking a vow of silence. This announcement really confused the other members of the community because the Hare Krishna tradition does not actually encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was just something Daniel had decided he wanted to do on his own. Right before he stopped speaking entirely, he also informed them that he would be leaving the community. So he took his vow of silence, packed up his few belongings, and walked out the door. After leaving the temple, Daniel began traveling across the country, committing a series of petty offenses in South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and eventually back in Florida. Because of his strict vow of silence, these encounters with law enforcement were incredibly bizarre. In Florida, he was arrested for stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. When he was brought before a judge in court, he refused to speak a single word. Instead, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. Ultimately, the judge sentenced him to 3 days in jail for the theft. After completing his short stint in the Florida jail, Daniel was just on relief, and he immediately decided that he wanted to go back to Orlando, Florida to visit SeaWorld again. It is assumed he wanted to check on the manatees he had swam with years prior, or perhaps see some of the other animals in the park. When Daniel arrived at SeaWorld during normal operating hours, he made his way over to the Killer Whale Stadium. A demonstration was about to start where professional trainers would swim around in a massive enclosure with these giant killer whales. Other visitors who were sitting in the stands that day would later recall seeing Daniel. They said they remembered him because he was standing in the crowd, completely transfixed, watching the show with his mouth wide open. He looked absolutely fascinated by these massive creatures swimming through the water. But Daniel's biggest reaction came when the trainers brought out Tilikum. Tilikum was the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. He was an absolute giant, and Daniel could not take his eyes off him. He was completely taken with Tilikum. That night, after the park shut down and all of the visitors and employees left, Daniel returned to SeaWorld. This time, he was wearing a bathing suit underneath his clothes. He walked up to the outer fence, hopped over it, and snuck back into the park, using the exact same methods he had used when he broke in to swim with the manatees years earlier. Somehow, Daniel managed to navigate through the entire park without being spotted by any of the security guards or picked up by any of the surveillance cameras. He made his way directly to the killer whale enclosure. He hopped the fence surrounding the massive pool, took off his shirt, took off his shoes, and left them on the concrete deck. Now, wearing nothing but his bathing suit, Daniel leaped into the cold, deep water of the pool to be with Tilikum. When Daniel had jumped into the manatee exhibit years before, he told people he just wanted to play with them, so investigators assumed he had the exact same intention when he jumped into the pool with Tilikum. He probably thought he could just swim alongside this massive predator and play with him like a friend. But unfortunately, Tilikum was indeed eager to play, but not in the way Daniel had imagined. The massive killer whale quickly grabbed Daniel by his swim shorts, dragging him down to the bottom of the pool. Tilikum held him under, dragging him back and forth along the bottom of the enclosure until Daniel drowned. After Daniel had passed away, Tilikum continued to play with his body, thrashing him around in the water, throwing him up and down, and ripping off pieces of his clothing and his body. Finally, Tilikum draped Daniel's lifeless body over his massive back, and that is where he kept him for the rest of the night. The next morning, when the SeaWorld staff showed up to start their shift, they walked out to the killer whale pool and made a horrifying discovery. They saw Daniel Duke's body draped over the back of Tilikum. The staff immediately tried to recover the body, but Tilikum was highly protective of his new toy and refused to let them near it. Whenever they tried to get close, Tilikum would swim away or pull the body back under the water. Eventually, the staff realized they could not safely get the body away from the 12,000-pound whale while he was in the water. They had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum completely out of the water and suspend him in the air so they could safely recover Daniel's body. Ultimately, the medical examiner ruled Daniel's death as an accidental drowning, citing his poor decision-making and hypothermia as contributing factors. Because it was ruled an accident caused by Daniel's own trespassing, Tilikum was not punished and he remained at SeaWorld. And that brings us to our next story, which takes us from the depths of a killer whale tank to the deep, dark underground of Mexico. In the year 1910, a group of miners was working inside of the Nika mine in Chihuahua, Mexico. As they were drilling deep into the earth looking for valuable minerals, their drill suddenly punctured through the solid rock, revealing a massive flooded cavern. The miners realized that they could not explore this space while it was full of water, so they brought in heavy equipment and pumped all of the water out of the cavern. Once the water was gone, the miners stepped inside, and they were absolutely amazed by what they saw. The walls and the ceiling of the cavern were completely covered in massive, beautiful gypsum crystals. It looked like an underground wonderland. But although these crystals were incredibly beautiful, they were far less valuable than what the miners were actually searching for, which was silver. The miners realized that trying to mine these crystals would not make them much money, so instead of destroying them, they decided to do something honorable. They went to the local residents in the area and told them about this incredible natural wonder they had just uncovered. They told the locals that they really ought to protect this cave and keep people from ruining it. The locals agreed, and for the next 100 years, the people of Chihuahua kept this cave, which they nicknamed the Cave of Swords, under lock and key. They made sure that no unauthorized people could go inside, preserving the amazing crystals for generations. Fast forward to the year 2000. Two miners were working inside of a different mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords was located, but another mine that was situated right up against it. They were drilling down deep, working at the exact same depth as the Cave of Swords, but they had no idea that they were actually drilling directly underneath it. As they were working, their drill suddenly broke through the solid rock, opening up yet another underground flooded cavern. Because these two miners did not realize how close they were to the Cave of Swords, they did not suspect that there would be any crystals inside this new cavern. They figured it was just another flooded pocket of earth that might contain silver. So, just like the miners had done 90 years earlier, they brought in pumps, drained all of the water out of the cavern, and prepared to go inside to investigate. Once the water was fully drained, the two men crawled down through the narrow opening and stepped inside. When they shined their flashlights around, their jaws dropped. They were standing in a massive cavern, and coming out of the walls, the floor, and the ceiling were these absolutely enormous crystals. These crystals were 10 to 15 times larger than the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. In fact, these were literally the largest gypsum crystals ever discovered anywhere in the world, with some of them measuring over 30 feet long. The cave looked like Superman's Fortress of Solitude, an unbelievable alien landscape of giant, glowing white pillars. This new cavern would eventually be named the Giant Crystal Cave, and just like the Cave of Swords, it was handed over to the local authorities to protect. Now, you would think that with the discovery of the largest crystals in the world, people would be lining up like crazy to get inside these caves to see this spectacular natural wonder. But the truth is, nobody wants to go inside these caves because they are literal death traps. Even though both of the caves had all of their water pumped out, the humidity level inside of them remains at a constant 100%. What this means is that the air is so saturated with moisture that if you stay inside the cave for too long, your lungs will actually begin to fill up with water. You will literally drown in the air, breathing in the moisture until you suffocate. Scientists who studied the cave estimated that it would only take about 10 minutes for a normal person to drown this way if they were not wearing a highly specialized breathing device that was pumping dry air directly into their lungs. But even if you were wearing one of those special air tanks, the cave would still find a way to kill you very quickly. The temperature inside the giant crystal cave regularly exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. If you combine that extreme heat with the 100% humidity and the tight, enclosed space of an underground cavern, you get a natural oven. If you stay in there for more than an hour, the heat will literally cook you alive. Because of these extreme dangers, the only people allowed to go inside the giant crystal cave are professional researchers wearing heavy, specialized protective suits and breathing apparatuses, and even they are only allowed to stay inside for a few minutes at a time. But in the year 2001, just 1 year after the giant crystal cave was discovered, one of the mine workers who had actually helped to drain the water out of the cavern decided that he wanted to get his hands on one of those incredible crystals. He figured that since he had helped prepare the cave, he deserved a souvenir. He knew the layout of the mine perfectly, and he knew how to access that specific locked-off section without anyone noticing. He waited until he was alone, and then he made his way down into the depths of the mine and slipped inside the giant crystal cave. The only piece of equipment he brought with him was a handsaw. His plan was very simple. He was going to walk inside, find a medium-sized crystal, saw off a piece of it, put it in his bag, and walk out. He figured the whole thing would only take him a couple of minutes, which was well within the safety window before the heat and humidity would start to affect him. He crawled into the massive cavern, looking around at the giant pillars of white crystal. He identified a crystal hanging from the ceiling that he thought would make a perfect souvenir. He climbed up onto some rocks, reached up with his handsaw, and began sawing away at the base of the crystal. But as he was sawing, the vibrations and the pressure dislodged a massive, heavy chunk of the crystal from the ceiling. Before he could react, the heavy crystal came crashing down, hitting him and pinning him tightly against the rocky floor of the cave. When the crystal fell on him, it did not kill him right away, but it trapped him completely. He could not move, and he could not lift the heavy crystal off his body. At this point, a terrifying reality must have sunk in for this worker very quickly. He had not told a single soul where he was going because what he was doing was completely illegal. He knew that security did not regularly patrol the inside of the cave, and he knew that nobody would be coming down to check on it anytime soon because the public was strictly forbidden from entering. He was completely alone, pinned in the dark, in an environment that was over 130 degrees with 100% humidity. A couple of days later, a group of authorized researchers made their way down into the giant crystal cave to conduct some scheduled studies. As they shined their lights around the cavern, they made a horrific discovery. They found the mine worker still pinned beneath the massive chunk of crystal that he had tried to cut from the ceiling. It was unclear to the medical examiners whether the man had died from his lungs filling with water due to the extreme humidity, or if he had been cooked alive by the oppressive heat. But either way, he was deceased. Following this tragic incident, the security surrounding the giant crystal cave and the Cave of Swords was tightened significantly, and today, both caves remain strictly off limits to the public, protected as highly dangerous natural wonders. And that brings us to our final story for today, which takes us to the beautiful but highly deceptive shores of Hawaii. On June 30th, 2002, an 18-year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his two younger brothers on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Daniel was an incredibly bright, charismatic, and kind young man who had just graduated from high school in Los Angeles, California. He was a natural leader, and during his senior year, he had served as his school's student body president. He was the kind of person who loved being around people and always wanted to make everyone feel included. He was famous among his classmates for constantly inviting huge groups of students over to his house for dinner, and girls at his school would call him all the time just to get his advice about their relationships because he was such a good listener. Daniel also had a huge heart for people who were struggling. He would frequently seek out troubled teens in his neighborhood and befriend them, doing everything he could to help guide them back onto the straight and narrow path. Before leaving for this family vacation, Daniel had been working a part-time job at a local grocery store, and he was excited to start college at California State University in the fall. He had his entire life ahead of him, and he was determined to make the most of his trip to Hawaii. On the morning of June 30th, Daniel decided to head down to the beach. His plan was to do some swimming, lay out in the sun, and just relax. Not long after he arrived, he struck up a conversation with three girls who were also hanging out on the sand. They chatted for about 30 minutes, laughing and getting to know each other, when Daniel noticed something interesting further down the beach. He pointed toward a rocky area and asked the girls if they wanted to climb over the nearby fence to check out the blowhole. Now, a blowhole is a very interesting natural geological feature. It is a narrow hole situated on the flat volcanic rocks right at the water edge. These holes are usually formed over thousands of years by molten lava flowing underground. As the lava cools and recedes, it leaves behind a hollow tube that connects the surface of the rock to the ocean below. When large waves crash against the shoreline, the water is forced into the underwater entrance of the tube and is rocketed up through the narrow opening on the surface, creating a massive, spectacular geyser of water that shoots high into the air. If you stand back and watch it from a safe distance, a blowhole is not dangerous at all. It is just a beautiful, awe-inspiring natural phenomenon to watch. But the beach where Daniel and the girls were hanging out was located right next to an infamously dangerous spot called the Halona Blowhole. The reason the Halona Blowhole was so dangerous is because the underwater tunnel it connected to was situated in some of the most violent, turbulent water in all of Hawaii. When the massive ocean swells came barreling into the coast, the water would rush through the tunnel with unbelievable force, shooting a geyser of water 30 feet or higher into the air. To make sure that visitors understood just how dangerous this area was, the local authorities had put up a sturdy fence all the way around the blowhole, and they had posted multiple signs warning people to stay back and not go any closer. To give you an idea of the sheer power of the water moving through that natural plumbing system, if you were standing on the safe side of the fence, you could actually feel the solid ground shaking beneath your feet every single time a wave rumbled through the underwater tunnel and exploded out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless or foolish person, but he was incredibly adventurous. He loved experiencing the raw power of nature, and when he saw the blowhole, his curiosity got the better of him. He could not stand the idea of just watching it from behind the safety fence. He wanted to get right up close to it. In fact, he turned to the three girls and told them that his goal was to stand right over the hole and feel the force of the water hit him directly in the chest. He thought it would be an incredible, exhilarating experience. The girls immediately told him that this was a terrible idea. They pointed to the warning signs and told him that the water was far too powerful and that he could easily get hurt. But Daniel was insistent. He was confident in his physical strength, and he believed he could handle it. He began walking over to the rocky ledge where he could climb up and get over the fence. The three girls decided to walk over with him, but they stopped short of the fence, refusing to go any further. As Daniel made his way toward the rocks, he passed by a couple who were relaxing on the beach. He gave them a friendly wave, climbed up the steep volcanic rocks, and hopped over the safety fence. He walked directly toward the opening of the blowhole. He stood there for a moment, carefully timing his movements. He waited for a large wave to come in, shoot a geyser of water into the air, and then recede. As soon as the water went back down and there was a temporary break in the action, Daniel walked right up to the edge of the opening. The hole was not very wide, and Daniel positioned himself right at the rim. He bent his knees and arched his body forward, hovering his chest directly over the dark opening, waiting for the next rush of water. Within seconds, a wave came through the underwater tunnel. A geyser of water shot out of the blowhole, hitting Daniel directly in the chest. The force of the water was incredibly strong, and it staggered him, knocking him back a few steps. At this point, the three girls who were watching from behind the fence, along with the couple Daniel had passed on the beach, began screaming at him at the top of their lungs. They yelled for him to get away from the hole and get back behind the fence before he got hurt. But Daniel did not listen. Instead of stepping back to safety, he walked right back to the edge of the opening and leaned over it once again. But this time, a massive, unusually powerful wave came barreling through the underground tunnel. Before Daniel could react, the water rocketed up through the blowhole with immense force. The blast of water was so powerful that it lifted Daniel completely off his feet, launching him about 5 feet into the air. The water spun his body around, turning him completely upside down so that his head was pointed straight down toward the ground. As the water pressure subsided, Daniel fell back down, going head first directly into the narrow opening of the blowhole. The couple and the three girls who witnessed this horrifying moment described his body position as being a perfect dive. And the tragic truth is, in order to actually fall into the blowhole, you would have to enter in a perfect dive position. The opening of the Halona blowhole is extremely narrow. It consists of an 8-foot-long, tightly enclosed vertical tube of rough volcanic rock. At the bottom of this 8-foot tube, the space opens up into a larger chamber, which is shaped very much like the inside of a teapot. Inside this chamber, the water is a vicious, churning washing machine of foam and current, which is constantly fed by the long underground tunnel leading out to the open sea. Once Daniel went headfirst down into that hole, his downward momentum, combined with his streamlined body position, forced him all the way through the narrow 8-foot tube and right into the teapot chamber. And once a person is inside that chamber, there is absolutely no way to climb back up. The walls of the tube are completely vertical, slick with water, and far too narrow and smooth to get any kind of grip or leverage. You cannot force your way back up against the gravity and the constant rush of water. The only other way out of that chamber is to swim through the underground tunnel that leads out to the open ocean. But the problem was that massive, violent waves were constantly pounding their way into that tunnel from the sea, pushing water up into the chamber. Anyone who tried to swim out through that tunnel would be fighting against an incredibly powerful incoming current, and they would likely be slammed against the jagged rock walls or trapped underwater. The moment Daniel disappeared into the blowhole, the couple on the beach and the three girls immediately panicked. They ran over the rocks, hopped over the safety fence, and rushed to the edge of the hole. They stared down into the dark opening, screaming Daniel's name, hoping to hear him answer. At the same time, they began shouting to the other people on the beach, telling them to call 911 immediately. As they stood there waiting and yelling for him, they could feel the solid rock beneath their feet start to shake again. Another wave was coming. A second later, a massive geyser of water erupted from the blowhole, spraying all over them. They knew that every single time the blowhole erupted, the chamber below was completely filled with rushing, turbulent water. If Daniel was still alive down there, he was being completely submerged in water and slammed against the rocks for 30 seconds or more with every single wave that hit the coast. By the time the emergency rescue crews and the police arrived at the scene, Daniel had been trapped inside the blowhole for a significant amount of time. Nobody had heard any signs of life from inside the hole, and nobody had seen him. The situation was looking incredibly grim. The responding police officers and lifeguards assessed the situation, but they quickly realized that the water conditions were far too dangerous to send any rescue divers down into the blowhole or into the surrounding ocean. It was high tide, and the waves were crashing against the rocks with extreme violence. The police explained to Daniel's frantic family that if they sent a diver into the blowhole or the underwater tunnel right now, that diver would almost certainly be killed by the force of the water. They had no choice but to wait until low tide the following day to conduct a proper search. The best the rescue team could do in the meantime was to lower a heavy weighted line down through the opening of the blowhole. They anchored the top of the rope securely on the outside deck, hoping that by some absolute miracle, Daniel was still alive in the chamber and would be able to grab onto the line. Even if he could not pull himself up through the narrow tube to safety, holding onto the rope would at least allow him to keep his head above water and prevent him from being swept out to sea by the undercurrent. But as the hours passed, there was no movement on the line. The next morning, when low tide finally arrived, the ocean calmed down just enough for the emergency divers to safely enter the water. They began searching the area around the Halona blowhole, focusing on the underwater tunnel and the surrounding cove. It did not take them long to find him. The divers discovered Daniel's body floating in the water near the outer entrance of the underground tunnel, where the ocean water gets sucked into the blowhole system. During the night, as the tide receded, the powerful currents had eventually pulled his body out of the teapot chamber, through the long underwater tunnel, and out into the open sea. It was impossible for the medical examiners to determine exactly how long Daniel had survived after falling into the blowhole, or if he had ever attempted to swim through the tunnel to escape. But ultimately, the cause of death was ruled as drowning. Following the tragedy, Daniel's devastated mother was determined to make sure that no other family would ever have to go through the horrific pain of losing a child to the blowhole. She started a petition asking the local government to install a heavy metal grate over the opening of the Halona blowhole. She argued that a metal grate would allow the water to shoot up safely while preventing any future visitors from falling into the deadly tube. But her proposal was met with a lot of pushback and criticism from the local residents of Hawaii. The locals argued that the blowhole was a precious natural landmark that should not be altered or defaced with man-made structures. They believed that the problem was not the blowhole itself, but rather the fact that people did not respect the warning signs or the immense power of nature. They argued that the fence and the signs were more than enough warning, and that people needed to take personal responsibility for their safety when visiting these beautiful but dangerous locations. Ultimately, the government decided not to install the grate. Today, the sturdy fence still surrounds the Halona blowhole, and the warning signs are still clearly posted telling visitors to stay back. But the opening to the blowhole remains completely uncovered, a stark reminder of the incredible, unforgiving power of the natural world. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the latter part of the summer of 2010, a man by the name of Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, was attempting to begin his life anew. On the surface, it might have appeared that everything was well. He was following a brand new and interesting activity when he was living in the sunny panhandle of Florida. Ben, on the other hand, was bearing a significant burden underneath. His hometown was Collierville, Tennessee, and it was there that he had established a prosperous construction company using his own two hands. He took great pride in it. However, when the housing market collapsed in 2008, his company went out of business, and it went out of business rather badly. In the end, he was left with nothing but debt, and a significant amount of it, amounting to almost $50,000. An individual who had given everything he had into his work was dealt a devastating blow by this. However, the financial loss was not even the most significant aspect of the situation. Before that, Ben had suffered the loss of his younger brother Paul a couple of years earlier. Due to the fact that Paul had suffered a stroke, Ben and his parents were left in utter disarray after his passing. Paul, on the other hand, was the more careful and grounded sibling, whereas Ben had always been the one who took risks and was the most adventurous. Ben's life was profoundly altered by the loss of him, and he had a difficult time coping with the pain that he felt. Shelby and Patty, his parents, watched as their surviving son drifted off into the distance. Despite the fact that he was depressed and disoriented, he was searching for something, anything, to satisfy his emptiness. His marriage had also ended in divorce, which was simply another aspect of his previous life that had disintegrated beyond repair. As a result, Ben came to the conclusion that he needed a significant shift. He relocated to Ponce de Leon, Florida, leaving behind his life in Tennessee, or what was remained of it, and brought his belongings with him. Scuba diving was the new hobby that he had discovered, and it was something that appeared to make him feel like he had a purpose once more. More specifically, he felt compelled to go to a location known as Vortex Spring. It is a lovely natural spring that produces a wide pool before feeding into a massive underwater cave system, making it a popular location for divers to visit. Ben was completely committed. He hired a tiny trailer on the property that was owned by the owner of the spring, and he committed himself entirely to exploring the underwater world. Within a relatively short period of time, he was able to move his certifications from open water diver to more advanced certification. He became certified extremely quickly. Nearly every single day, he would be found there, swimming in the crystal clear water that was refreshing. Ben saw the undersea environment as a means of making his escape. At that point, it appeared as though the burden of his financial obligations and his sorrow simply vanished. He was able to simply be there because it was a serene and placid location. However, a few of the other divers who were part of the close-knit society that existed at Vortex Spring saw something else in Ben. They observed a man who was going too far and moving too quickly with things. Cavern diving is widely considered to be among the most hazardous sports in the world. Having an extraordinary amount of patience, precise planning, and a profound regard for the harsh environment are all necessary components. Cave divers with years of experience, and often even decades of experience, spent developing their skills. On the other hand, Ben appeared to be in a hurry most of the time. It was his goal to dominate the cave, to go further and deeper than anyone else had ever gone before. It was said that he had a cowboyish presence, and even that he was haughty. It is said that he expressed a desire to find a way to pass through a particularly tight and perilous restriction deep into the cave, which was a location that experienced explorers had believed to be inaccessible. The thought of exploring new areas of the cave and establishing a reputation for himself was something that he was entirely preoccupied with. Some of his close friends and family members were concerned that he was not taking the risks seriously enough, and that his desire to change his identity was causing him to act in a risky manner. As the sun began to set on the 18th of August 2010, Ben prepared himself for yet another dive. There were lengthy shadows cast across the sea as the sun was about to set. As he made his way to the end of the pier, the heavy gear he was carrying rumbled with each step he took. He wore his mask around his neck, his tanks were on his back, and he was holding his fins in his hand. The act was something that he had performed 100 times before. After a few periods of gazing out over the lake, he quickly pulled his mask over his face, placed his regulator in his mouth, and then walked off the edge, sinking beneath the surface with a splash. The entrance to the cave was a dark maw at the bottom of the spring basin, perhaps 50 feet below the surface. He was moving in that direction. The light from his headlamp cut a beam through the blue water as he fell through the water without any difficulty. As soon as he reached the entryway, he continued on his way into the darkness. In the field of cave diving, the initial explanation put out to explain what took place after that was straightforward and sadly common. It was around 7:30 that evening that the staff at the Vortex Spring diving shop, a guy called Chuck Cronin and the owner's son, Lowell Kelly, reported seeing Ben enter the dive shop for his dive. They were aware that he was a devoted diver who frequently went in by himself. They did not instantly get concerned when he did not come to the surface after a few hours had passed. It is possible that divers, particularly those who are investigating the cave, could be down for an extended period of time. However, as the night progressed and there was still no trace of him, a stoic concern started to develop underneath the surface. The next day, when he still hadn't come up, that worry grew into genuine terror due to the circumstance. At that moment, his truck was still parked in the lot. There was only his dog in his trailer by himself. The situation was not right. At the same time as the authorities were contacted, a search operation was initiated. Once the Walton County Sheriff's Office arrived, it was immediately apparent to everyone that the initial assumption was correct. It was discovered that Ben McDaniel, a diver with a relatively low level of experience who was notorious for testing his limits, had entered a hazardous underwater cave and had not emerged from it. There must have been some kind of mishap. In one of the cave's winding side channels, he might have become disoriented and lost his way. It was possible for him to become trapped in a restrictive situation. It's possible that his apparatus broke down. It's possible that he went out of breath. The cave had a reputation for being a murderer. One of the signs that was placed close to the entrance was a gloomy warning to divers about the dangers that they faced. It was a stark reminder of the many other people who had died in its depths throughout the years. The narrative appeared to be written by itself. The cave had taken another victim, and this time it was Ben McDaniel. In the context of this particular sport, it was a tragedy, but it was a risk that was acknowledged. Instead of being a rescue mission, the mission was now a recovery mission. In order to locate his body, they were going inside. The search for Ben McDaniel was a massive effort that was fraught with a great deal of vulnerability. Finding a body in a setting that is simply open water is already a challenging task. There is a completely different level of difficulty involved in locating one within a cave system that is flooded, such as Vortex Spring. There are a number of narrow channels that wind their way through the cave. The floor is coated in a fine silt that has the consistency of talcum powder. Even the slightest touch from a hand or a fin can cause a cloud of this silt to be kicked up, which can reduce visibility to zero in a matter of seconds. It is referred to as a silt out, and it is one of the worst nightmares that a cave diver may experience. It is possible to become utterly bewildered, to the point where you are unable to see your hand in front of your face and to locate the guideline that will bring you back to a secure location. As a result of these dangers, the sheriff's office was forced to bring in the most qualified individuals possible, cave rescue and recovery divers who are volunteers and have had extensive training. They were individuals who willingly went into locations where other people had passed away, putting their own lives in danger in order to provide a family with some sense of closure. It was on August 20th, 2 days after Ben was last seen, that the first teams entered the building. They proceeded in accordance with the primary guideline that could be found in the cave's most often visited areas. As they searched every nook and cranny, their strong lights penetrating the murky water, they looked for any indication that Ben may be present. A person, a piece of equipment, a fin, a mask, or anything else may have been what they were looking for. And still, they discovered nothing. A peculiar and unnerving pattern started to emerge as the first day of seeking moved into a second, and then a third, as the 3 days of searching continued. All traces of Ben McDaniel were completely absent from the scene. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, the divers entered the more hazardous areas of the cave. After that, they headed to the location where it was said that Ben was preoccupied with discovering a new tunnel. Every single dead end and every single small compartment was investigated. Nothing has changed. Certainly, this was not the norm. It is extremely simple to locate the deceased in the vast majority of cave diving accidents that result in fatalities. The majority of the time, they are discovered with all of their gear on, entangled in the guideline, or constrained by a restriction. The cave has a way of retaining its victims. However, in this particular instance, the cave appeared to be devoid of any inhabitants. An odd discovery was uncovered after a couple of days had passed since the beginning of the hunt. There was a discovery of 2 of Ben's diving tanks. On the other hand, they were not discovered far within the cave, which is where you would anticipate them to be if he had dropped them in the event of an emergency. They were discovered in the open water basin, which was located outside the entrance to the cave. The employee of the dive shop, Chuck Cronin, said that he discovered them. This was the first piece of information that did not appear to be consistent with the straightforward accident account. That 2 of his tanks were located outside of the cave is a mystery. It is common practice for divers to position stage bottles at specific points in order to retrieve them later for longer dives. Nevertheless, the positioning of these bottles was peculiar. The results did not appear to be consistent with any of the typical cave diving procedures. Despite the peculiar discovery, the search that was being conducted inside the cave continued. They were unrelenting in their pursuit. They looked on for several days. They went so far as to bring in specialized equipment in order to attempt to blast through a rock pile that was blocking a narrow tunnel that Ben had been interested in. They were under the impression that Ben had managed to pass through the obstruction and is now stuck on the other side. On the other hand, the endeavor was not only risky, but also ultimately failed. It was decided to call off the official search after nearly a week of intense, high-risk searching, during which more than a dozen professional divers searched every available inch of the cave. They had not discovered anything. Ben and his equipment were completely absent from the scene. It was said by the primary investigator for the sheriff's office that if Ben was indeed there in the cave, his body would be located in a section that was just inaccessible to rescue workers. According to the official record, it was thought that Ben McDaniel had drowned, and his body was reported to have been lost forever in the gloomy and silent depths of Vortex Spring. It was impossible for Shelby and Patty McDaniel, Ben's parents, to believe the official explanation that was provided and accepted it. It is incomprehensible that their son, along with all of his heavy diving equipment, including his tanks, his fins, his weight belt, and his lights, could suddenly disappear without a trace inside that cave. Quite simply, it was completely illogical. When it came to his dives, they were aware that their son was a risk-taker for sure, but they also knew that he was a thorough planner. He meticulously documented each and every dive that he went on. To them, the concept that he would simply vanish without a trace from their lives seemed illogical. Although they were experiencing a great deal of loss, they were also developing a strong sense of distrust. The sensation that they were not being told the complete story was something that they were unable to shake. They acted in the manner that any other parent would. They were not willing to give up. They secured the services of Kelly Fleischman, a well-known private investigator hailing from the state of Florida. In addition, they offered a hefty reward, which finally reached $30,000 for any information that could lead to the rescue of their son. The investigation into the case was initiated by Fleischman, who conducted more interviews with witnesses and examined the facts with a new perspective. And as she continued to look, the straightforward diving accident idea started to entirely disintegrate before her own sights. Not only did she discover a single problem in the narrative, but she discovered an entire string of them. The 2 air tanks that were discovered outside of the cave were the first major problem that needed to be addressed. An examination of the air carried within them was carried out. As it turned out, they were filled with the typical compressed air that is found in the atmosphere. The kind of deep, sophisticated cave diving that Ben was purportedly undertaking would have required him to use specialized gas combinations, such as nitrox or trimix, in order to avoid oxygen poisoning and nitrogen narcosis. Although Ben was known for his recklessness, it was highly doubtful that he would have made the rookie mistake of using plain air at the depths that he was purportedly exploring. This would have been an extremely dangerous situation. Even stranger was the fact that the tanks were found to be almost completely full. Just a little bit less air was contained within them than they would have been immediately after being filled. It was clear from this that Ben had only used them for a little period of time, if he had used them at all. What was the rationale behind him bringing 2 large tanks into the water, using them for a minute or two, and then leaving them outside the cave afterwards? Under any diving circumstance, it was completely illogical to do so. After that, Fleischmann began investigating the employees of Vortex Spring, namely the 2 workers who were the last to see Ben and who were involved in the search for the tanks. These workers were Chuck Cronin and Lowell Kelly, the owner's son. It was the private investigator's opinion that their accounts were inconsistent with one another. It seemed as though their time frames of when they had last seen Ben and when they became aware that he was missing were slightly different from one another with each new account. It was hardly a conclusive piece of evidence, but it was sufficient to raise suspicions. In addition to this, Fleischmann discovered some peculiar information regarding Ben's life around the time that he disappeared. He was in possession of 2 mobile phones. While he was in the parking lot, one was discovered in his truck. There was a lack of the other. The truck also had his wallet, which contained his identification as well as his credit card. If he was only going to go for a dive, we don't see why he would leave his wallet behind. The vast majority of individuals would keep it safe in their vehicle. It was discovered that his dog, a cherished companion that he kept with him everywhere he went, was locked inside his small trailer without any food or water. The fact that Ben would ignore his animal in such a manner, even for only one evening, appeared to be cruel and out-of-character behavior. In addition, the condition of his trailer was very questionable. At first glance, it appeared as though someone had tried to use it. Unfortunately, a few of his personal possessions were not found. Moreover, there was the issue of his diving logs to consider. The entry in Ben's journal for his final dive, which took place on August 18th, appeared to be incorrect. Ben was obsessed with keeping a log of his dives. Some others questioned whether or not the handwriting was even his. It was hasty and lacking in information, and it was not at all like his earlier entries that were extensive. It appeared as though it had been filled out by someone else in order to make a record of a dive that might not have actually taken place in the manner that it was portrayed. Despite the fact that the cave itself was intended to be the repository of all the answers, the cave itself was the source of the most significant flaw, the one that completely destroyed the official idea. Over the course of the subsequent couple of years, the McDaniel family supported a number of more private searches of the cave by spending their own personal funds. They had a strong desire to locate their son, or at the very least, to demonstrate that he was not present. Ed Sorensen, a man who is considered to be a legend in the world of cave diving, was hired by them in the year 2012. With his seemingly superhuman ability to traverse and explore the most perilous and tightest underwater caves on the world, Sorensen has earned a reputation for being an exceptional cave explorer. When nobody else is willing or able to go, people look to him as the person to go for recovery. In the history of Vortex Spring, Sorensen carried out one of the most extensive searches that have ever been completed. He remained in the cave for several days. He was able to circumvent constraints that were so tight that he had to remove his gear and squeeze through the openings on the side. Through his exploration of the cave system, he traveled further than any of the previous search parties had gone. He looked into every possible option, every rumor, and every lead that was available. His goal was to find any indication of a human body or any pieces of equipment. His conclusion was unquestionable and immovable, despite everything that had transpired. In a public statement, he asserted with complete and utter certainty that the body of Ben McDaniel was not found contained within the Vortex Spring Cave. He stated that there was no physical method for a body to have entered the areas of the cave that had not been inspected, regardless of whether or not tools were present. In the event that Ben had passed away inside that cave, Ed Sorensen would have located him. He did not discover anything. A single remark made by an expert has completely altered everything. Could you please tell me where Ben was if he wasn't in the cave? There was no longer any basis for believing the claim of a terrible diving catastrophe. Another event had taken place on the 18th of August in the year 2010. Following Ed Sorensen's exhaustive investigation, which proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the accident explanation was not true, two new options emerged, each of which was more sinister and intricate than the one that came before it. In the course of the inquiry, which was now being led by Ben's family and their private investigator, an attempt was made to piece together what might have actually occurred on that particular evening. First, there was the possibility of some kind of criminal activity. Kelly Fleischman, a private investigator, came to the conclusion that Ben had been murdered and that his disappearance had been manufactured to appear as though it was an accident that occurred while he was diving. Putting this hypothesis back together, the reconstruction looks somewhat like this. The fact that Ben was not liked by everyone at Vortex Spring was something that had been established. A man who did not respect the established order in the community, he was perceived as being haughty. He was exerting a lot of effort in order to gain entry to the more hazardous and gated-off area of the cave, which was a privilege that was only granted to the most reliable and experienced divers. It's possible that he got into a disagreement with someone at the dive shop on that particular evening. Perhaps the dispute became more heated. It is possible that a confrontation takes happen in this situation, possibly on the pier or in close proximity to the ocean. The situation escalates into a physical confrontation, and Ben is either killed unintentionally or on purpose. The individual or individuals concerned are currently experiencing a state of panic. They are currently dealing with a deceased individual in a well-known tourist site. A cover narrative is required, and they need to get rid of it as soon as possible. And what could be a more fitting cover tale than an accident that occurred while cave diving at a well-known location? They are aware that if they are able to make it appear as though Ben was lost and perished in the cave, then it is possible that his body will never be located, and no individuals will ask an excessive amount of questions. Therefore, they carry out their plan while doing so under the cover of darkness. They remove Ben's body and dispose of it in a location that is very far away from Vortex Spring, specifically a location where it will never be discovered again. Following that, they collect some of his diving equipment. For the purpose of giving the impression that he drove himself to the parking lot, they drive his truck there. They steal 2 of his tanks, which may have been the most convenient ones they could grab, which explains why they were filled with the incorrect kind of air. The tanks are dropped right beyond the entrance to the cave, generating a piece of evidence that is misleading. They walk down to the water and drop the tanks. To further their efforts to sell the tale, they may have even fabricated the final entry in his dive log. They then wait for a day and discover that Ben is missing, at which point they report him as a diver who has gone missing. Despite the fact that they are well aware that the cave will not provide any results, they focus the search in that direction. Each piece of evidence that lends credence to this viewpoint is convincing. The fact that Ben and his heavy gear were never discovered in the cave is explained by this explanation. It provides an explanation for the tanks that were put in an unusual manner and contained the incorrect air mixture. It provides an explanation for the inconsistencies that were stated by the staff of the dive shop, who the family feels were engaged in the incident. Lowell Kelly, the owner's son, has been singled out as the person on whom the family has placed the blame. Although they first brought a lawsuit against him for wrongful death, the case was eventually dismissed. They are of the opinion that he, along with possibly others, had a reason to harm Ben and the opportunity to cover it up. However, the local law enforcement has indicated that they have never discovered sufficient evidence to identify any suspects or treat the case as a homicide after they investigated the case. A very different picture of Ben McDaniel is painted by the second main theory, which is just as astonishing as the first major theory. The hypothesis of a staged disappearance is expressed in this way. Based on this reconstruction, it appears that Ben was not the victim of any kind of criminal activity, but rather the mastermind of his own disappearance. We are aware that Ben was during a very difficult period in his life. It was $50,000 worth of debt that he was drowning in. He was still in a state of mourning over the death of his brother. His company had been unsuccessful. He was feeling dejected and desperately looking for a way out, a new beginning. According to this scenario, Ben carefully planned to act as if he had already passed away. Because he was aware of the cave's reputation for being dangerous, he decided that Vortex Spring would be the ideal place. There is a possibility that disappearance could occur there. For several weeks or perhaps months leading up to the 18th of August, he worked on getting everything ready. It is possible that he was gradually removing the things that were most important to him from his trailer, things that he would require in order to start a new life. It's possible that he was putting money aside or developing a new identity at the time. A significant amount of cash was reportedly withdrawn from his account just before he disappeared, according to the reports. The strategy was put into action on the evening when he vanished without a trace. He puts on some of his gear and makes a show of going for a dive in order to make sure that the personnel at the business notice him. On the other hand, it's possible that he didn't even enter the water at all, or that he merely conducted a very brief dive that was shallow. It is a purposeful red herring, a piece of misleading evidence that he leaves behind the 2 air tanks in order to make the investigation more difficult to understand. After that, he sneaks out while it is still dark outside for shelter. The possibility exists that he has a getaway automobile hidden in a nearby location, or that he has an accomplice waiting to pick him up. In order to sell the story that he met his end in the spring, he abandons his truck, his wallet, and one of his phones, along with the rest of his belongings. He gives up his dog, which is a terrible reality, but an essential component of the strategy. In an instant, Ben McDaniel vanishes from existence, and a new individual emerges, liberated from the burden of debt and the anguish of a troubled history. Additionally, the data that supports this viewpoint is significant. He is experiencing severe mental and financial stress, which gives a great motivation. There is no physical evidence of a struggle or a body, which is a strong indicator that the crime in question is not a murder. It is more sanitary. Over the course of the years, there have been a number of unverified sightings of persons that resembled Ben in various regions of the country, and even in countries outside of the United States. A few days after he was said to have vanished, a waitress in a nearby town was convinced that she had given him breakfast. The theory is maintained by these sightings, despite the fact that none of them have ever been authenticated. It is a tantalizing possibility that Ben outwitted everyone and successfully started a new life, leaving his family to live in a state of uncertainty for the rest of their lives. While the investigation into Ben McDaniel's disappearance became less active during the years that followed, the mystery continued to grow more perplexing. In the official sense, it is still a case of a missing person. The year 2013 marked the year that Ben was officially pronounced dead, 3 years after he had been last seen. This permitted his parents to take care of his estate. Nevertheless, the legal pronouncement was of very little significance to them. The funeral was never held by them. In no way did they ever erect a headstone. In their hearts, they were unable to mourn the loss of a son whose future was still a total mystery. Both emotionally and financially, Shelby and Patty McDaniel were subjected to a mountain of hardship. They used their own money to pay for private detectives, prizes, and private search attempts, which totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. They exerted a great deal of effort in order to keep the case of their son in the public view, with the expectation that somebody, somewhere, would come forward with the piece of information that would eventually break the case open. They felt that the first investigation was bungled and that their suspicions of foul play were never taken seriously enough. As a result, they became extremely upset with the Walton County Sheriff's Office. The authorities, on the other hand, contended that they were unable to take any action because they did not have a body or any other tangible evidence related to the crime. The investigation was a frustrating mix of peculiar occurrences and theories that had not been examined in depth. In spite of the fact that they are at the core of the family's suspicions, the staff at Vortex Spring have always maintained their claims of innocence. They have not wavered from their narrative, which states that Ben was a careless diver who met a horrible end in the cave, regardless of whether or not his body was situated there. For years, they have been subjected to accusations on the internet and scrutiny from the general public, but no charges have ever been brought against them. The circumstances surrounding Ben McDaniel's disappearance continue to cast a pall over Vortex Spring, despite the fact that it continues to function as a popular diving hole. Ben's story has become a modern legend among the larger community of people who are interested in real crime and those who are divers. It has been discussed endlessly on internet forums and in films. There is a thorough examination of every aspect, including the tanks, the dive record, and the witness statements. The opinions of individuals are sharply divided amongst the three hypotheses. Was it a bizarre accident in which a corpse was lost in a manner that defies all logic and experience for the reason that it was lost? Could it have been a cold-blooded murder that was then covered up in a flawless manner? On the other hand, was it the most extreme kind of flight, a man who pretended to die in order to begin a new life? After everything is said and done, the case leaves us with a spooky silence. The truth about what took place at Vortex Spring on the 18th of August 2010 is nearly impossible to discern, despite the fact that the water there is completely transparent. It is only Ben McDaniel himself who is aware of the events that took place with absolute certainty. There is a possibility that his family will never receive the justice that they have battled so hard for if he was murdered. Those who murdered him may have been able to get away with the perfect crime. In addition, if he had fabricated his own disappearance, he would have left his parents in a painful state of limbo where they would be unable to grieve and would be unable to move on with their lives. During the time that they are locked in a nightmare of not knowing, they are left to worry each and every day whether or not their kid is still alive from somewhere in the world. Ben was meant to be able to escape through the cave, but in the end, it turned out to be a perpetual jail, not for his body, but for the truth and its contents. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?
Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else, something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back. But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Don was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Don was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, "Go over it again." What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, "I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it." They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Dawn asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luowan village. Luowan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luowan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma King Mao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma King Mao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma King Mao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma King Mao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma King Mao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Malene. Malene was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Malene's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Malene were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed, in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding onto an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time.
Millions of people go into the deep woods every single year. They go to find peace. They go to escape the loud noises of the city. They want to connect with nature and clear their minds. Most of the time, these people have amazing trips. They hike the trails. They sit by the campfire. They look up at the stars, and then they go home to their families with great memories. But sometimes people go into these massive forests and they simply vanish. They disappear under conditions that make absolutely no sense at all. In some cases, people are walking right next to their friends or family. They turn around for just a second. When they turn back, their companion is gone. There is no sound. There is no struggle. There is just empty space. In other cases, people go missing, and then they are found days later in places that are completely impossible to reach. They are found on top of high cliffs or deep inside thick briar patches where there are no paths. For a long time, no one was looking at these cases as a whole. People just assumed they were isolated incidents. They thought people simply got lost, or fell, or got attacked by wild animals. But one man changed that. His name is David Paulides. He is a former police detective. He spent years investigating crimes and looking at evidence. One day, he started noticing that there were thousands of these bizarre disappearances happening in national parks and forests all over North America. He realized that nobody was keeping a central database of these missing people. The government was not tracking them. The Park Service was not keeping a master list. So, David decided to look into it himself. He started gathering police reports, search and rescue logs, and talking to the families of the victims. He began putting all of his findings into a fascinating series of books called Missing 411. These books outline very specific patterns that show up in these disappearances over and over again. Today, we are going to look at 3 of these cases. These are stories about people who went camping in the beautiful wilderness, and then things went horribly wrong. Let us start in 1985. Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old man who lived in Sacramento, California. Kevin was the kind of guy who lived for the outdoors. He was not a casual hiker who just walked on paved paths on the weekends. He was an outdoor enthusiast. He loved the challenge of testing himself against nature. He loved going on long hikes, pitching his tent in the wilderness, and sleeping under the stars. For years, Kevin had one dream that stood above all the rest. He wanted to go camping in Alaska. To him, Alaska was the ultimate frontier. It was the wild, rugged land that every serious camper wanted to conquer. By the summer of 1985, Kevin decided that he was finally going to make this dream a reality. He started doing massive amounts of research. He looked at maps of Alaska. He read books about the different terrains. He studied the weather patterns. He wanted to find a place that was truly wild. Eventually, he settled on an area called Glacier Bay National Park. Even by Alaskan standards, Glacier Bay is incredibly rugged. It is a place of massive glaciers, cold, deep water, dense forests, and tall mountains. It is a place where you are completely on your own. There are no cell phone towers. There are no roads. If you get into trouble, help is not coming quickly. Kevin knew this. He was a smart guy. He was not foolish. He knew that going into the Alaskan wilderness by himself was a huge risk. So, to prepare, he did not just buy gear. He actually enrolled in a specialized class. This class was designed to teach people how to survive in the wild Alaskan environment. He learned how to handle extreme weather. He learned how to keep his food safe from brown bears. He learned how to navigate without a compass if he had to. He spent weeks studying and practicing. He wanted to make sure he was ready for absolutely anything. On the 20th of September, 1985, Kevin finally boarded a plane in Sacramento. He flew to Juneau, Alaska. When he landed, he felt the cold northern air. He was incredibly excited. From Juneau, he had to take a boat and hike his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park, the first thing he did was walk into the park headquarters. He wanted to register his trip. This is what responsible campers do. He walked up to the park rangers who were working at the desk. He introduced himself. He told them that he was going to be camping over near the Wolf Point area. Wolf Point is a very isolated spot. It is located right against the cold water of the bay. Kevin told the rangers that he planned to be out there for about 3 weeks. He said he would be leaving the park on October 10. The rangers wrote all of this down. They were glad he checked in. They knew that there was now a 36-year-old man from California staying by himself near Wolf Point. They knew his exact timeline. For the next couple of weeks, no one heard from Kevin. His family, back in California, did not get any phone calls or letters. The park rangers did not see him. But this was exactly how Kevin wanted it. The whole point of his trip was to escape reality. He wanted to live in nature. He wanted to disconnect from the modern world and just be alone with his thoughts. So, because he was not supposed to contact anyone until October 10, no one was worried. No one raised any red flags. The days went by, and the wilderness remained quiet. But then, we get to October 8. This was 2 days before Kevin was scheduled to pack up his gear and leave the park. On this day, a couple of park rangers were out on a routine patrol. They were in a small motorized boat navigating the waterways around Wolf Point. They knew that Kevin's campsite was nearby. They knew he had been out there by himself for almost 3 weeks. Because they were close by, the rangers decided to take a little detour. They wanted to pull their boat into the bay at Wolf Point and just check in on him. They wanted to make sure he was doing okay and see if he needed anything before his scheduled departure in 2 days. They steered their boat toward the shore. They turned the last corner where they could finally see the area where Kevin was supposed to be camping. And as soon as they looked at the shoreline, they froze. They knew immediately that something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent. It was not where it was supposed to be. There was a flat, grassy area of soil slightly inland where campers always set up their tents. It was the safest and most level spot. But Kevin's tent was not there. Instead, the tent was sitting down on the gravel beach. It was right next to the water where the tide could easily reach it. This made no sense. An experienced camper would never pitch a tent on a wet beach right by the freezing ocean water. As they got closer, they noticed something even more disturbing. Some of Kevin's gear was lying outside of the tent. It was not scattered around like a tornado had hit it. It was placed outside. It looked like someone had deliberately set it on the ground. And then they looked at the tent itself. The top strut, which is the fiberglass pole that holds the top of the tent upright and keeps the fabric tight, was completely folded down. It looked like it had snapped right in the middle. The tent was partially collapsed. The Rangers stopped their boat. They got out and walked onto the gravel. The air was cold and silent. They called out Kevin's name. They yelled into the trees. No one answered. The only sound was the wind and the water hitting the shore. The Rangers stood there and tried to think logically. They thought, okay, maybe Kevin is getting ready to leave in 2 days. Maybe he is packing up his camp. Maybe he decided to go on one last day hike to see the sights before he departs. They figured that the broken tent pole might have happened during a strong windstorm and he just had not fixed it yet. They told themselves that everything was probably fine. They did not want to panic. So they decided to get back in their boat and leave. But they made a plan to come back the very next day to double check on him. The next morning, October 9, the Rangers returned to Wolf Point. They pulled their boat up to the beach. They looked at the campsite. There had been absolutely no change. The tent was still sitting on the beach in the exact same spot. The broken top strut was still collapsed. The gear was still sitting outside on the sand. The sleeping bag and the sleeping pad were untouched. It was incredibly clear that Kevin had not returned to his campsite since the Rangers were there 24 hours earlier. At this point, the Rangers became deeply concerned. They knew they could not wait any longer. They needed to find Kevin. They immediately contacted their headquarters and launched an official search. The search effort was massive. The Park Service brought in small airplanes to fly low over the Wolf Point area and the surrounding forests. They hoped to spot Kevin's bright clothing or perhaps a smoke signal from a campfire. But they saw nothing. Just green trees and cold gray water. Then they brought in ground searchers. These searchers walked shoulder to shoulder through the thick brush. They brought in highly trained search dogs. These dogs were experts at picking up human scent and tracking it through the wilderness. The searchers went to Kevin's campsite first to see what they could find. What they discovered at the campsite made the situation even more baffling. When they searched the collapsed tent and the immediate area, they found virtually all of the equipment you would expect to find at a campsite. In fact, he had everything he needed to survive. His backpack was leaning against a tree. It was fully packed. Inside the backpack, they found his food, his extra warm clothes, and his water container. It was packed as if he was just about to go on a hike. His sleeping bag, his sleeping pad, and his cooking equipment were all right there. But the most bizarre thing was the food. Kevin had a lot of food left. Some of it was sitting out in the open, completely exposed to the elements. In Alaska, this is unheard of. The forests are filled with hungry animals. There are brown bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, and foxes. If you leave food out in the open in Alaska, animals will find it. They will tear your camp apart to get to it. But none of the food at Kevin's campsite had been touched. Not a single animal had nibbled on it. It was completely pristine. This was a massive anomaly. It was as if the local wildlife was actively staying away from the campsite. The searchers kept pushed outward. They sent the dogs into the thick brush surrounding the camp. They searched for hours. And then the dogs started alerting. They ran toward a deep gully that was located about half a mile away from the campsite. This gully was incredibly steep and filled with thick vegetation. You could not see into it from the trail. It was completely hidden from the naked eye. The dogs scrambled down into the gully, and the searchers followed them. At the bottom of the gully, the dogs found something. It was Kevin's boots. They also found his glove liner and his hat. They were tucked away, almost as if they had been placed there deliberately. When the searchers found these items, the initial theory was that Kevin must have been attacked by a bear. It seemed like the only logical explanation. He was in the deep Alaskan wilderness, and now his clothes and boots were found half a mile away in a gully. But the park rangers who were leading the search disagreed. They had lived and worked in Alaska for decades. They had seen bear attacks before. They knew what a bear attack looked like. They said this was definitely not a bear attack. When a human is attacked by a large predator like a grizzly bear, there is a massive struggle. The human fights for their life. They grab onto branches. They kick up the dirt. They flail around. There are broken bushes, torn clothes, and most importantly, there is blood. But at Kevin's campsite, there was absolutely no sign of a struggle. There was not a single drop of blood. There were no human remains. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had been hurt in that space. And then there was the question of the food. If a bear had come into the camp and attacked Kevin, the bear would have smelled the food. Bears are driven by their sense of smell. They would have eaten every scrap of food in that camp. But the food was untouched. The rangers kept coming back to how quiet the camp was. There was no animal activity at all. No birds, no rodents, nothing. It was like a dead zone. With no clues left at the camp, investigators went to speak with Kevin's family in Sacramento. They asked them if Kevin had been depressed. They asked if there was any chance he had gone out into the woods to end his own life. The family was shocked. They said, absolutely not. They said Kevin was incredibly happy. He was well adjusted. He was so excited about this trip. He had spent months preparing for it. He had even taken that survival class. They told the investigators that Kevin had planned on taking a few short day hikes, but he had no plans to do any overnight trips away from his main camp. He also had no plans to meet up with anyone else. He wanted to be completely alone. After just a few days of searching, the weather in Alaska began to turn. The temperatures dropped and the snow began to fall. With absolutely no leads, no tracks, and no signs of where Kevin could have gone, the authorities had to make a difficult decision. They called off the search. Kevin O'Keefe was officially gone. Now, let us look at the facts. We know that all of Kevin's gear was still at his campsite. His backpack was packed. This means he did not leave his camp voluntarily to go on one of those day hikes he told his family about. No experienced hiker, especially one who took a survival course, would ever walk into the Alaskan wilderness without their pack, their food, and their extra clothes. Doing that is an absolute death sentence. You would freeze or starve in a matter of days. So, Kevin must have been at his campsite when something happened to him. But we know it was not an animal attack because there was no blood, no struggle, and the food was not touched. So, if it was not an animal, what was it? What could have caused his tent to be moved down to the beach? What broke the top strut of his tent? What caused him to leave his gear behind, and why were his boots, his glove liner, and his hat hidden in a steep gully half a mile away? And most importantly, where was Kevin? To this day, no one has ever found him. He vanished into the wild, leaving behind nothing but questions. Now, let us fast forward to the year 2000. We are going to move south, down to the state of Montana. Patrick Whalen was 33 years old. Pat was not just an outdoor enthusiast. He was someone who bordered on being a full-blown survivalist. This was a man who possessed incredible outdoor skills. He did not just go camping for weekends. He lived in the wild. He had hiked thousands of miles across the Pacific Crest Trail, which is one of the longest and most difficult hiking trails in the entire world. He had spent hundreds of hours camping in deep, isolated forests, but out of all the places he had ever visited, there was one place that he loved more than anywhere else. That was Glacier National Park in Montana. Glacier National Park is famous for its stunning beauty. It has massive peaks, deep valleys, and thick pine forests. But it is also incredibly wild and dangerous. Pat loved it. He spent so much time in Glacier National Park that he became a regular face. The park rangers who worked there got to know him. They recognized his face. They knew him by name. They knew he was an expert who could survive in almost any condition. They never worried about him when he went into the park because they knew he had the skills to handle anything. On the 2nd of November 2000, Pat was driving his truck in an area called Kiowa Junction, which is just outside the park in Montana. As he was driving down the road, a deer suddenly jumped out in front of his truck. Pat could not stop in time. He hit the deer. Now, what happened next is one of the strangest parts of this entire story. There were witnesses who saw the accident. They watched Pat stop his truck and get out. He walked over to the injured deer lying on the side of the road, but he did not call for help. He did not try to put the animal out of its misery. Instead, he walked back to his truck. He grabbed a pillow from the cab. He walked back to the deer and gently placed the pillow under the deer's head. Then he went back to his truck again. He grabbed some food, walked back to the deer, and placed the food right next to its mouth. And then, without saying a word to anyone, Pat just walked away. He abandoned his truck right there on the side of the road. It is not clear if the truck was damaged so badly that it could not run, or if Pat just decided he was done with it. But either way, he left it. The next day, local authorities found the abandoned truck and had it towed to a local tow lot. Nobody knew where Pat had gone. He had simply walked off into the landscape. 6 months went by. During this time, Pat's family had not heard a single word from him. This was not entirely unusual for Pat, as he liked to go off the grid for long periods of time. But 6 months was a very long time, even for him. His father began to get deeply worried. He decided to call the park rangers at Glacier National Park. He knew how much Pat loved that park. He told the rangers that he had not heard from his son in months. He said he was terrified that something had happened to him. He asked them if they had seen Pat in the park. The rangers, who remembered Pat well, told his father that they had not seen him recently. But they promised they would keep an eye out for him during their patrols. A couple of weeks after that phone call, 2 park rangers were out on a routine patrol in a remote, heavily wooded section of Glacier National Park. As they were walking through the dense trees, they stumbled upon a very odd scene. They saw a blue tent set up in the middle of a clearing. There was no campfire burning. There was no sound of anyone around. As they got closer, they noticed that the middle strut, the main pole that held the tent up, was collapsed. The tent was sagging badly. The rangers stopped. They yelled out to see if anyone was inside. They wanted to make sure whoever was in there was okay. But no one answered. The forest was completely silent. They walked up to the tent. They could see that the fabric of the tent was extremely weathered. It was faded and sun-bleached. This meant the tent had been sitting out in the elements for a very long time. But despite being sun-bleached, there were no tears in the fabric. There were no holes. And most interestingly, all of the zippers on the tent were completely shut. The Rangers reached down and unzipped the tent. They peered inside. There was no one there. But the tent was not empty. Inside, they found all of the items you would expect to find at a survivalist campsite. There was water, plenty of food, a camping stove, extra clothes, and his boots. Everything was neatly placed inside. But Pat was gone. And just like in the case of Kevin O'Keefe, the Rangers noticed something highly unusual. There was food inside this tent. The tent had been sitting unoccupied in the middle of a wild national park for months. Glacier National Park is prime grizzly bear territory. Bears have an incredible sense of smell. They can smell food from miles away. They will easily rip through tent fabric to get to a single energy bar. But this tent had no tiers. No animals had tried to get inside. The food was completely untouched. The Rangers immediately filed a report and a search was launched. Authorities brought out search teams and cadaver dogs. They combed the woods around the blue tent. They looked under logs and in ravines. But they found nothing. The dogs could not pick up any scent at all. One of the biggest challenges the searchers faced was that they had no idea when Pat had actually arrived at the spot or when he had disappeared. They went to the tow yard where his truck had been taken 6 months earlier after the deer accident. The truck was still sitting there. Pat had never come to claim it. This meant he had likely walked straight into the park 6 months ago and had been missing ever since. But as the investigators searched the inside of the blue tent more closely, they found one detail that was incredibly chilling. They found an empty leather case for a buck knife. The sheath was there, but the knife was gone. David Polides looked at this detail and offered a very interesting theory. Pat was an expert survivalist. He knew how to handle himself in the woods. He was sleeping in his tent one night. Suddenly, he heard something outside. It was not a normal sound. It was something formidable. It was something that made a seasoned, brave survivalist feel the need to arm himself. Pat reached down, pulled his heavy buck knife out of its sheath, and prepared to go outside. The mosquitoes in that area of Montana are notoriously bad, especially at night. So, even though Pat was in a hurry, he stepped out of the tent and took a second to zip the tent completely shut behind him. He did this to keep the bugs from getting inside his sleeping area. He stood outside in the dark, holding his knife, ready to confront whatever was making that noise. And then, he never went back inside. Whatever was out there in the dark apparently got the best of Pat. But we cannot simply say he was attacked by a wild animal. If a bear or a mountain lion had attacked him right outside his tent, there would have been a massive struggle. There would have been blood on the ground. There would have been torn clothing or broken branches. But the campsite was clean. There was no blood. There were no remains. And again, if a hungry predator had killed Pat, it would have smelled the food inside the tent and ripped it open. But the tent was left untouched. So what did Pat hear? Why did he grab his knife and step out into the night? What did he confront and where did he go? To this day, Patrick Whalen has never been found. His empty blue tent and his empty knife sheath are the only clues he left behind. Now, let us move to our third story. This takes us to April of 1976 in the state of New York. Stephen Thomas was 19 years old. Steve was a young man who was full of life. He was athletic, adventurous, and he absolutely loved hiking. He had spent a lot of time hiking in the rugged mountains of Washington state, so he was very experienced. He knew how to handle steep trails and rough weather. In April of 1976, Steve was living in New York. His good friend Bruce Weber contacted him. Bruce said that he and 4 of his friends were planning to go on a hike up Mount Marcy. Mount Marcy is the highest peak in the state of New York. It is a massive, beautiful mountain, but it is also very dangerous. The weather near the summit can change in an instant. It can go from sunny to freezing cold and windy in a matter of minutes. Steve did not know the other four guys who were going on the trip. But he trusted Bruce and he loved hiking, so he eagerly agreed to join them. On the morning of the hike, Steve was packing his gear at his home. His mother was watching him. She had a very strange, uneasy feeling in her chest. She looked at her son and told him that she had a really bad feeling about this trip. She told him that maybe he should just cancel. She did not like the idea of him going up such a rugged mountain with people he did not know very well. She begged him to stay home. But Steve just smiled. He was 19, he was confident, and he had a lot of hiking experience. He told his mother that she was worrying too much. He said everything would be completely fine and that he would see her in a couple of days. He gave her a hug, grabbed his gear, and left. On the 12th of April, 1976, the 6 young men began their trek up Mount Marcy. The hike was long and exhausting. The trail was steep and they had to carry heavy packs. By about 3:30 inches the afternoon, they had made their way near the summit of the mountain. They were very close to the top, but they were all completely exhausted. The wind was picking up and the temperature was starting to drop. The group decided that instead of pushing all the way to the summit today, they would make camp right where they were. They would pitch their tents, rest for the night, and then attack the summit the next morning when they were fresh. Everyone was relieved to stop and rest, except for Steve. Steve was restless. He had a lot of energy, and he did not want to sit around. The group set up their tents, and Steve went into Bruce's tent. He sat down and started studying the map of Mount Marcy. He looked at the trail leading up to the summit. He looked at Bruce and asked if he wanted to go for a quick walk up the path with him. He said he just wanted to stretch his legs and see what the trail looked like. But Bruce was exhausted. He told Steve no. He said he was too tired and that they should just wait and go up together tomorrow morning. Steve did not want to wait. He boiled some water and made himself some tea. He sat there for a bit, drinking his tea and looking at the map. But he just could not sit still. Finally, he folded the map up. He looked at Bruce and said that he was just going to walk up the path a little way by himself. He promised he would be right back. Bruce immediately told him that this was a bad idea. He told him not to go up there alone. The sun was starting to go down. The temperatures were dropping fast. The wind was getting stronger. It was a recipe for disaster. The other hikers, who did not know Steve very well, also chimed in. They told him he should just stay in the camp and rest. But Steve was stubborn. He shrugged his shoulders and said he would only be gone for a few minutes. Because Steve thought he was only going to be gone for a short walk, he did not pack any gear. He left his backpack in the tent. This backpack contained his food, his water, his map, his matches, and his extra warm clothing. He was wearing just a t-shirt and pants. Before he walked out of the tent, he grabbed a bright yellow rain jacket and threw it on over his t-shirt. That was it. He had no supplies. He had no way to make fire. He had no water. He just walked out of the tent and headed up the trail. At the time Steve left, the ground was covered in hard-packed snow. The snow was frozen solid, which actually made it very easy to walk on. You did not sink into it. And because it was a clear night, there was a bright full moon shining down on the mountain. The moonlight reflected off the white snow, making everything incredibly bright. You could see for a long distance without even using a flashlight. As Steve walked away from the camp, the other hikers were annoyed with him for being stubborn, but they were not really worried. They knew Steve was an experienced hiker. He had hiked in much tougher conditions in Washington. The trail was clear, the snow was hard, and the moon was bright. They figured he would walk up the trail for 10 or 15 minutes, get cold, and then turn around and come back to the warm tent. It seemed like a minor thing. But then, an hour went by. By this point, the sun had completely set. It was night. The temperature on the mountain had plummeted to well below freezing. The wind was howling through the trees. Steve had been gone for an hour, and he was only wearing a t-shirt and a light yellow rain jacket. He was not dressed to survive sub-freezing temperatures for long. The hikers realized that something was wrong. They walked a short distance up the trail and started yelling Steve's name into the wind. They listened, but they heard nothing. Only the sound of the wind. They realized they had to go look for him. The conditions were getting deadly, and if Steve was hurt or lost, he would freeze to death very quickly. The hikers turned back to their tents to grab their heavy winter gear and flashlights so they could go make a search trek up the mountain. Now, one of the 4 hikers that Steve did not know very well had brought his dog along on this trip. This dog was highly energetic. It was the kind of dog that loved being outdoors. It loved hiking. Anytime the dog had the chance to run around in the woods, it would do it in a heartbeat. It was never tired, and it was never scared. But when the owner went into his tent to get his gear, he went to grab his dog's leash to bring the dog with them to search for Steve. He figured the dog's sharp senses would help them find him in the dark. But the dog refused to leave the tent. The owner pulled on the leash, but the dog would not budge. Instead, the dog cowered in the very back of the tent. It was shaking. It was whimpering and acting like it was absolutely terrified of something that was right outside of the tent. The owner was stunned. He had never, in all his years, seen his dog act this way. The dog was so terrified that it refused to step 1 foot outside into the night. It would rather stay alone in a dark, cold tent on a mountain than go outside with its owner. The hikers did not have time to figure out what was wrong with the dog. They had to find Steve. They left the terrified dog in the tent and went out into the freezing night. They hiked up the trail, shining their flashlights and calling out. But the wind was too strong, and the cold was biting. After searching for a while, it became too dangerous for them to continue. They were starting to get hypothermia themselves. They had to make the painful decision to turn back to their camp. They crawled into their sleeping bags, listening to the wind, and prayed that Steve had somehow found shelter on the mountain. As soon as the sun rose the next morning, the hikers were out of their tent. They started searching again, yelling Steve's name. But there was no sign of him. The snow was still hard-packed, but there were no fresh footprints. After a few hours of searching, with no luck, the group had to make a decision. 3 of them decided to stay at the camp in case Steve returned. The other 3, including Bruce, began the grueling 4-hour hike down the mountain to get to a vehicle so they could drive to the nearest town and alert the authorities. Once the authorities were notified, they did not hesitate. They launched one of the largest and most intensive search and rescue operations in the history of the state of New York. Over the next 2 weeks, the mountain was crawling with searchers. They brought in helicopters to fly over the peaks. They brought in professional search dog teams. They had hundreds of ground searchers combing every single foot of the mountain. They were looking for any sign of Steve. They thought that because he was wearing a bright, high-visibility yellow rain jacket, he would be incredibly easy to spot against the white snow or the green trees. But they found absolutely nothing. It was like Steve had dissolved into the air. After 2 weeks of intense searching, the official rescue effort was called off. The authorities believed that Steve had succumbed to the elements and that his body was lost somewhere in a deep crevice. But Steve's family refused to give up. In particular, his older brother, Bob. Bob was 26 years old. He was in incredible physical shape, and he was extremely close with his younger brother, Steve. When the official search ended, Bob made a life-altering decision. He quit his job. He packed up his life and moved to the Mount Marcy area. He dedicated his entire life to finding his brother. For a whole year, Bob searched Mount Marcy. He did not just walk the main trails. He went deep into the trackless wilderness. He climbed steep cliffs. He crawled through thick brush. He searched caves and ravines. The veteran park rangers who worked on Mount Marcy began to joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Over that year, Bob walked over 2,500 miles on the mountain. He reached the summit of Mount Marcy over 600 times. Every single time he went up, he took a different route. He looked under every boulder. He peered into every bush. He was looking for any scrap of yellow fabric. But he never found a single trace of his brother Steve. The only thing Bob did find during his year-long search was the skeletal remains of another hiker. This was a person who had gone missing on the mountain 3 years earlier. No one had been able to find him. Bob was able to recover those remains and bring closure to that missing hiker's family. But as for his own brother, there was nothing. This brings us to some very strange questions. How could Bob, who searched 2,500 miles and summited the mountain 600 times, miss his brother? Steve was wearing a bright yellow rain jacket. That jacket would not decompose in a year. It would have stood out like a beacon against the gray rocks and green trees. If Steve's body was on that mountain, Bob or the search dogs should have found him. And then there is the question of the dog. Why was that highly energetic trail dog so terrified that night? What was outside of the tents that made the dog cower in fear and refuse to help its owner? Dogs have senses that are far sharper than ours. They can smell and hear things we cannot. The dog clearly sensed something in the dark. Something that was close to the camp. Something that was terrifying. And why did Steve feel such an overwhelming urge to walk up that trail alone in the first place, leaving all of his survival gear behind? When we look at these three cases together, we start to see some truly bizarre patterns. These are the patterns that David Paulides writes about in his Missing 411 books. First, look at the victims. Kevin O'Keefe, Patrick Whalen, and Stephen Thomas. They were not inexperienced tourists. They were not people who got lost because they did not know how to read a map. Kevin took a wilderness survival class specifically for Alaska. Pat was a seasoned survivalist who had hiked thousands of miles on the Pacific Crest Trail. Steve was an experienced mountain hiker who had tackled rough terrain in Washington. These were men who knew the dangers of the woods. They knew that leaving your gear behind is a fatal mistake. Yet, all three of them did exactly that. Kevin left his fully packed backpack by a tree. Pat left his gear inside his zipped tent. Steve left his pack in Bruce's tent. Second, look at the tents. In both Kevin's case and Pat's case, the main support strut of their tents was broken or collapsed. A tent strut does not just break on its own unless there is extreme wind, but in both cases, the weather had not been bad enough to cause that kind of structural failure. It looked as if something had pushed down on the tents, or as if the tents had been grabbed. Third, look at the food. In the wilderness, food is gold to wild animals. If you leave food out in the open in Alaska or Montana, it will be gone in hours. Bears, wolves, and rodents will smell it and find it. But in Kevin's case, his food was left out in the open and remained completely untouched. In Pat's case, his food was inside a tent for 6 months and no animals ever ripped the tent to get to it. It is as if the local wildlife was actively avoiding these campsites. This is a huge red flag. Animals avoid areas where they feel a dominant, terrifying presence. And finally, look at the hints of a threat. Pat Whalen's empty knife sheath suggests he heard something so threatening that he drew his knife and stepped outside to face it. The dog on Mount Marcy was so terrified of whatever was outside the tent that it cowered and whimpered. If we try to reconstruct what actually happened to these men, we have to look past these standard explanations. The authorities wanted to believe these were simple accidents. They wanted to believe Kevin fell in a gully, Pat got lost, and Steve froze in a crevice. But the evidence does not support those theories. If Kevin fell into a gully, why were his boots, hat, and glove liner found neatly tucked away in that gully half a mile from his camp while his body was nowhere to be found? Why would he walk half a mile barefoot over rough Alaskan terrain? It is physically impossible to do that without destroying your feet, yet his boots were found clean and undamaged. Did something carry him there? Did something force him to take his boots off? If Pat got lost, why did he leave all his gear, including his boots, inside his zip tent? A survivalist does not wander off into the Montana woods barefoot without his gear. He stepped outside with his knife to face something. Whatever it was, it took him. It took him without a struggle, without leaving a drop of blood, and without disturbing the tent. If Steve froze in a crevice on Mount Marcy, why did his brother, who searched 2,500 miles, never find a single thread of his bright yellow jacket? Why did the dog cower in fear? There are many theories about what is happening in these deep forests. Some people believe there are wild, feral humans living in the remote areas of our national parks. They believe these people have lived off the grid for generations, and they hunt campers for survival. They know the terrain perfectly. They know how to move without leaving tracks. They know how to ambush someone silently. Others believe there are predators in the woods that science has not yet discovered. They talk about legendary creatures like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. They point to the broken tent struts, the heavy objects being moved, and the way search dogs refuse to track the scent. They say that animals are terrified of these creatures, which would explain why no wildlife came near Kevin's or Pat's campsites to eat the food. And then there are those who believe in even stranger things. They talk about portals or tears in space and time. They believe that under certain conditions, people walk off a trail and simply slip into another dimension. This would explain why people disappear in a second and why their bodies are sometimes found in areas that had been searched by hundreds of people multiple times. We will likely never know the truth. The government and the Park Service continue to remain silent about these disappearances. They do not want to scare the public. They do not want people to stop visiting the parks. But the files remain open. The aftermath of these disappearances is a heavy, lingering grief. For the families of Kevin, Pat, and Steve, there is no closure. There is no grave to visit. There are no answers. They are left with a permanent void in their lives. They are left with the haunting knowledge that their loved ones went into the beautiful, peaceful woods and encountered something so terrifying that they were never seen again. When you go into the deep woods, it is easy to feel small. You look up at the giant trees and you realize how massive the wilderness is. You feel a sense of awe. But the next time you are out there and the sun starts to go down and the forest gets quiet, pay attention. Listen to the wind. Look at the shadows. If the birds suddenly stop singing and the woods go completely silent, remember these stories. Remember that you might not be as alone as you think. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a low murmur began to build on a quiet street in the city of Versailles, France. The street itself was unremarkable, lined with plain buildings, but on this particular night, it was becoming the center of a strange and growing spectacle. People were starting to gather, arriving in small groups, their voices a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet dread. They stood in clusters on the cobblestones, their faces illuminated by the occasional gas lamp, all eyes fixed on one specific building. It was the Saint-Pierre prison, a stone structure that held one of the most infamous men in all of France. The atmosphere in the crowd was electric, a kind of dark energy you could almost feel in the air. Everyone knew exactly why they were there. They knew what they were about to witness, an event that hadn't been seen in that region for a very long time. But even with that knowledge, there was a heavy sense of anticipation. It was a morbid curiosity that had drawn them out of their beds and into the cool night air. Some people in the crowd were trying to cope with the tension by turning it into a social event. They passed around flasks of alcohol, their laughter a little too loud, their jokes a little too forced. They were trying to create a festive mood as if they were waiting for a parade to start. But others were much more subdued. They stood silently, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. They were there not for entertainment, but to see what they believed was justice, a final, definitive end to a chapter of terror that had gripped the country. The man inside the prison was Eugene Weidmann, a 31-year-old German national who had been convicted of multiple murders. His crimes were brutal, calculated, and driven by greed, and his trial had been a media sensation. He and his small gang had preyed on tourists visiting Paris, luring them to a secluded villa with the promise of a good investment or a sightseeing trip, only to rob and kill them. The story of his last victim, a young American dancer named Jean de Koven, had been particularly heartbreaking and had sealed his fate in the public consciousness. So for many in the crowd, this night was about closure. Sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, a set of heavy doors on the prison building creaked open. The crowd instantly went quiet. Every head turned. A group of men emerged, all dressed in identical dark uniforms. They didn't speak a word to the crowd or even acknowledge their presence. They moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and fascinating. The crowd, which had been pressing forward, instinctively began to back away, creating a wide open space in front of the prison. These men carried with them pieces of heavy lumber and a collection of tools. They walked to the center of the cleared space and, without any spoken commands, they began to work. They were there to build the instrument of justice, the very reason everyone had gathered. They were building a guillotine. The crowd watched, mesmerized. They wanted to get a closer look, to see the grim machine take shape, but a sense of fear or perhaps respect for the process kept them at a distance. They formed a silent half moon around the workers. The men moved with incredible efficiency, a seamless choreography born from practice. It was clear that this was not the first time they had performed this task. Every movement was precise, economical, and devoid of any emotion. It was just a job to them. One man would place a beam on the ground, and another would be right there with the hardware to fasten it. They assembled the 2 tall upright posts, the bois de justice or woods of justice that would guide the blade. Then came the heavy angled blade itself attached to a weighted block called a mouton. It was hoisted to the top of the posts and locked into place, gleaming under the streetlights. They assembled the bascule, the tilting plank on which the condemned would be strapped, and the lunette, the wooden collar that would clamp around the neck. By about 3 in the morning, the structure was complete. It stood there, tall and imposing, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. The workers placed a large wicker basket next to it and a smaller metal bucket directly under where the blade would fall. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, they packed up their leftover tools and materials, turned around, and disappeared back inside the prison, closing the heavy doors behind them. With the guillotine now standing ready, the crowd's restlessness grew. The initial nervous energy began to curdle into impatience. They knew the next time those doors opened, the main event would begin. The show they had all come to see was imminent. But minutes turned into an hour, and then longer. The prison remained silent. The crowd started to murmur again, wondering what the delay was. Everyone knew that public executions were supposed to happen before dawn. The official policy was to conduct them in darkness, or at the very least, in the dim light of early morning. This was done to maintain a degree of somberness and, more practically, to prevent the press from getting clear photographs or film of the event. Officials didn't want the proceedings to turn into a media circus. But for some unknown reason, things were being held up inside the prison. As the delay stretched on, the crowd grew louder. The more boisterous members, fueled by alcohol, started shouting and jeering. The atmosphere was losing its grim solemnity and was taking on the ugly feel of a mob. Then, around 4:45 in the morning, a soft gray light began to appear on the eastern horizon. The sun was coming up. The delay had been too long. And with the daylight came the press in full force. Photographers jockeyed for the best positions, setting up their tripods and aiming their large cameras at the prison doors. Newsreel cameramen were there too, ready to capture the entire event on film. At this point, most people in the crowd assumed it was over. They figured the authorities had missed their window and would call it off. Surely, they wouldn't proceed in broad daylight in front of all these cameras. But they were wrong. At exactly 4:50 in the morning, the prison doors swung open one last time. Standing in the threshold was Eugene Weidman. His arms were bound tightly behind his back. He was wearing a simple white shirt, and the collar had been carefully folded down, tucked inside, leaving his neck completely bare and exposed. On either side of him stood a grim-faced prison guard. They pulled him forward, out into the morning light, and towards the waiting crowd. Behind him, the executioners, dressed head to toe in black, filed out and took up their positions around the guillotine. As Weidman was led out, the crowd erupted. The sound was a wild, chaotic roar. People were shrieking, howling, and laughing. They pointed at him, booing and shouting insults. The scene had descended into a complete frenzy, a bloodthirsty spectacle that no one had anticipated. Eugene Weidman kept his head down the entire time. He seemed to be making a conscious effort not to look at the jeering crowd, and certainly not at the towering machine that awaited him. He shuffled forward, his steps guided by the two guards. They turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine. When they reached it, the black-clad executioners took over. They moved with the same swift, impersonal efficiency as the men who had built the structure. They grabbed Weidman and maneuvered him onto the tilting plank. They slid him forward on his stomach, pushing him along the wooden platform until his head passed through the semicircular opening of the lunette. Another piece of wood slid into place, clamping his neck securely. He was now positioned perfectly, his neck directly beneath the massive, angled blade that dangled high above him. His head was positioned over the metal bucket on the ground, which would have been the last thing he saw. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch. Their shouts reached a crescendo. One of the executioners, the chief executioner, Jules-Henri Desfourneaux, calmly reached out and pulled a lever. There was a sharp metallic click, followed by a swishing sound as the heavy blade was released. It came soaring down the tracks with incredible speed. In less than a second, it was over. His head was severed from his body. The head fell cleanly into the metal bucket below. Immediately, the executioners pushed his now lifeless torso off the plank and into the large wicker basket that had been placed beside the guillotine. The guards and executioners then gathered up Weidman's remains, the basket, and the bucket, and carried everything back inside the prison. The whole procedure, from the moment Weidman appeared at the door to the moment his body was taken away, lasted only a matter of minutes. As the prison doors closed, the crowd, instead of dispersing, went wild with a strange celebratory energy. They cheered and then surged forward, running up to the guillotine. They began dabbing their scarves and handkerchiefs in the pool of Eugene Weidman's blood that had collected on the cobblestones. They were taking home a souvenir from the execution. It was a ghastly medieval scene, and because the sun had been out, it was all captured in stark detail. The photographers had their pictures, and the newsreel cameras had their film. In the days that followed, the headlines all across France were not about the execution of a notorious killer, but about the shocking and barbaric behavior of the crowd. The photographs and news reports painted a picture of a bloodthirsty mob cheering and celebrating a man's death. It made France look uncivilized, and the story became an international embarrassment. The French president at the time, Albert Lebrun, was said to be absolutely horrified by the reports and the accompanying images of the so-called hysterical public. He and other French leaders decided that the spectacle of public executions had no place in a modern society. They concluded that these events did not serve as a deterrent to crime, but instead only encouraged the basest and most violent instincts in the public. And so, a decision was made. From that point forward, there would be no more public executions in France. The guillotine would continue to be the state's method of capital punishment for several more decades, but its use would be hidden away from public view, carried out behind the high, cold walls of prisons. Eugene Weidmann's execution on June 17, 1939, was the very last time the public would ever witness the guillotine in action. There's a strange and unsettling footnote to the science of death by guillotine. For centuries, there have been anecdotal reports and debates about whether the head remains conscious even for a few moments after being separated from the body. It's said that consciousness can persist for about 10 to 12 seconds. There are numerous historical accounts where, after the blade fell, an executioner would pick up the severed head and yell the condemned person's name. In some of these cases, it was reported that the head's eyes would turn towards the sound of the voice and the eyelids would blink, or the mouth would try to form words. This would continue for several seconds before the lack of oxygen finally shut down the brain and all signs of life vanished. The thought that a person could be aware of their own decapitation, even for a fleeting moment, adds another layer of grimness to an already brutal process. The images captured on that morning in Versailles served as a stark and permanent record of the end of an era, a final, public performance of state-sanctioned death that ultimately repulsed the very society it was meant to serve. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, is small and quiet. It is 15 miles east of Vancouver, near the Fraser River. The ground is saturated with mud in winter due to wet, cold, and gray weather. This is where Robert Pickton was born in 1949. Robert, his brother and sister, lived in a remote and unusual environment. Their parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, ran a huge pig farm. Life was hard, dirty, and demanding. Locals thought the parents were eccentric, detached from the community, and indifferent to hygiene, but they were hardworking. They spent most of their waking hours working the muddy land, raising hundreds of pigs, and raising their children in a strange environment. Young Robert and his siblings were expected to work on the farm. Long hours in the dirt, animal slaughter, and strict, harsh parental rule characterized their lives. Robert was a strange, quiet child. He was teased at school for smelling like a farm and having mud and animal waste on his clothes. He became isolated and socially awkward as he struggled to fit in. Though eccentric, his brother was more outgoing, while their sister tried to distance herself from the family business as she aged. Over the years, the family ran the pig farm in relative isolation from the growing town. However, both parents died in the late 1970s. A turning point for the siblings. The three children received the entire large, valuable property. The sister immediately rejected the hard, dirty life of a pig farm. She packed up her belongings, sold her property share to her brothers, and moved as far as possible to start over. This left Robert and his brother to run the farm alone. They now ran the family business. The problem was that neither Robert nor his brother wanted to or could manage a business this size. The pig farm was managed for a few decades, but they soon gave up. Long, slow decline began at the farm. Rusted machinery, old cars, and trash made it an eyesore in the community. The pigs were still free to roam the property, digging through garbage, according to neighbors and visitors. The brothers and farm seemed to decline together. They appeared to have stopped bathing to anyone who met them. After walking through thick mud and pig feces all day, they never took off their heavy leather boots inside their living quarters. They would walk from the filthy pens to their trailers, dragging waste. They were always dirty, their clothes were stiff, and they smelled like manure and decay, so people avoided them in public. Some farm workers stayed with the Pictons as the farm declined, despite the poor conditions. These workers included Bill Hiscox. Bill spent many hours on the property doing odd jobs and caring for the animals. He later described the farm as creepy and unsettling, especially at night when shadows covered the dilapidated barns. He said Robert Picton was creepy and prone to bizarre, unpredictable behavior. This was even stranger because Robert never smoked, drank, or used illegal drugs. Although sober, he often fell into strange trances, mumbled to himself, and reacted to normal situations in ways that made everyone around him uncomfortable. The Picton brothers realized they were not suited to run the pig farm like their family had for generations. The business was losing money, the property was falling apart, and they were exhausted from physical labor. Their best option was to sell some of their land for quick cash. But neither could have predicted the value of their land. From 1994 to 1995, the brothers sold most of their property to an urban developer. Because Port Coquitlam was growing rapidly and expanding outward, developers needed lots of land to build new homes and businesses. The brothers sold their land for over $5 million. These filthy, failed pig farmers in squalor became multimillionaires overnight. They had no idea what to do with that money. They had millions in the bank after living in the mud their whole lives. For a year, they sat on the money and did little with it, living in rundown trailers on the small portion of the farm they kept. However, they decided to use their wealth for good, or at least appear to. The Piggy Palace Good Times Society was registered as a charity in 1996. The charity held dances, shows, and concerts to raise money for community organizations, sports teams, and needy families, according to their government paperwork. Despite their good intentions, the charity turned out differently. The brothers used it to throw wild, drug, and alcohol-fueled parties. They held these parties in their old slaughterhouse, a large metal and wood building on the property. Even though the slaughterhouse was no longer used for pig farming, big iron hooks hung from the wooden ceiling, and dark, old bloodstains covered the concrete ground underneath them. The Piggy Palace parties became notorious in Coquitlam. Large crowds of up to 2,000 people would attend. Many bikers, gang members, drug addicts, and sex workers from Vancouver's impoverished downtown east side attended. Drugs flowed freely, loud music played all night, and bonfires burned in the yard. Because the property was private and off the main roads, police rarely intervened. Robert Picton was well versed in that impoverished Vancouver neighborhood. He regularly drove his truck through there to dispose of animal waste at a rendering plant for years. He saw vulnerable street people on those trips. Robert frequented that neighborhood after the Piggy Palace charity began. He slowly cruised the Low Track, a 10-block downtown east side strip known to locals. The streets were full of sex workers trying to survive. Robert drove up and tried to get people to come to his farm for parties. Most of his recruits were impoverished women with severe drug addictions. They agreed to ride in his truck because he offered free food, cash, hard drugs, and unlimited alcohol. They saw a trip to the farm as a temporary escape from the harsh, cold streets, a place to get a warm meal and money without worrying about the city's dangers. At the same time Robert was recruiting, downtown Eastside women disappeared in droves. A woman could walk her corner one week and disappear the next. Downtown Eastside residents and workers noticed these disappearances immediately. They tracked each other and knew when someone disappeared. Unfortunately, they did not report these disappearances to authorities. Police and authority figures were deeply distrusted by the street community. They kept their worries to themselves and looked out for each other because they felt the police didn't care. But as more women disappeared from downtown Eastside, rumors of a serial killer spread. Fear was palpable. Residents altered their behavior. All were on edge and would only go outside if they could walk in a large group. They kept an eye out for suspicious people or slow-moving cars in the neighborhood. Despite this precaution, women disappeared rapidly and nobody knew why or where. The police responded poorly when family members and advocates contacted them about these missing women. No crime scenes or bodies were found, so police told the families to assume the women were responsible for their absences. They suggested that their high-risk lifestyles had caught up with them and that they had either fled to another city to start over or overdosed in a hidden alleyway and was still missing. The police refused to intervene despite downtown Eastside residents' pleas that this was different, that these women would never abandon their children or belongings, and that something was seriously wrong. They did not investigate the cases as homicides, viewing them as missing people who would likely be found. This apathetic police response prompted local newspapers to heavily criticize the department. They accused the police of intentionally deprioritizing these missing women because most were drug addicts and sex workers, suggesting they were not worth a full, expensive investigation. The police denied this claim, insisting they were following standard procedures, but tensions between the community and the police increased as the list of missing women grew. Tuesday night, the 22nd of March 1997, things changed drastically. 1 year had passed since the Piggy Palace Good Time Society was founded, and massive parties began, and dozens of women had disappeared from downtown Eastside. The Pictons' closest neighbor was inside their house when they heard a frantic, heavy knock on their front door one night. A neighbor rushed over and opened it. What they saw on their porch shocked them. In agony, a woman stood with one hand on her bleeding stomach. One metallic handcuff hung from her other wrist. The sight horrified the neighbor, but they acted quickly. They took the bleeding woman inside, locked the door, and called an ambulance. The woman was rushed to the hospital under emergency lights and prepped for emergency surgery to save her life from a deep abdominal stab wound. She chatted with her nurses in the recovery ward after the anesthesia wore off. She introduced herself as Wendy. She said she attended a Picton farm party. While she was there, farm owner Robert Picton lured her into his trailer. After entering, he tried to handcuff her wrist. Wendy immediately sensed danger and fought back, refusing to let him get the second cuff. Robert stabbed her in the stomach with a large knife during the fight. Wendy reclaimed the knife despite the excruciating pain and blood loss. She swung it at his face, stabbing him in cheek and nose. Wendy fled out the trailer door into the cold night while Robert was reeling from the blow. She ran through the mud, slipping and sliding to the neighbor's house. After Wendy told the nurses this terrifying story, something amazing happened. Robert Picton visited the same hospital. He sought emergency room treatment for a serious facial laceration. Stabbing was confirmed by the wound. After hearing Wendy's story, the medical staff recognized him and called the police. Officers arrived at the hospital minutes later. Robert was in the treatment room when they found a metal handcuff key in his pockets. They tested that key on Wendy's handcuff. The key turned, opening the handcuff. With this physical evidence, police arrested Robert Picton for attempted murder immediately. It appeared the case was closed. However, Robert met with investigators and gave his account while in custody. He informed the officers that Wendy lied. He said she was a drug addict who had come to the farm for a party and tried to rob him in his trailer. Robert said she became violent and drew a knife when he confronted her about the theft. He said they fought and were stabbed, as he tried to defend himself. Robert looked the officers in the eye and said he was lucky to survive. Amazingly, the police believed Robert's story over Wendy's. Due to her lifestyle and addiction, they considered Wendy unreliable. Because of this bias, they dropped all charges against Robert and released him. He left the police station and returned to his farm, acquitted. The only worker on the property, Bill Hiscox, was suspicious when Robert returned. Bill read all the downtown East Side missing women news. He knew Robert frequently went there to pick up women and had seen many of them return to the farm for parties. Bill had always felt something was off about Robert, and this hospital incident with Wendy confirmed his worst fears. Bill sat on this gut feeling for 2 months, growing uneasy in his farm chores every day. He finally realized he had to share. He called Crime Stoppers. He told the operator that Robert had attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that Robert was likely responsible for some or all of the downtown East Side women's disappearances. Bill provided more crucial evidence to support his claim. He told the police that Lisa, a recent farm guest, saw something disturbing in Robert's trailer. Lisa had noticed a messy pile of women's clothes, at least 10 purses, and women's ID cards. The police investigated this tip. They asked Lisa to confirm what she saw in the trailer. However, Lisa was terrified of Robert when they spoke. She refused to cooperate with the investigation or sign a statement because she knew his abilities. The police said they didn't have probable cause to search Robert's trailer or farm without her testimony. Instead of digging deeper, they closed the file and moved on to other cases, leaving Robert to his daily routine. In subsequent years, the Pictons held massive, chaotic Piggy Palace parties. While they brought hundreds of vulnerable people to the farm, dozens more downtown East Side women disappeared without police investigation. This happened despite Bill Hiscox calling the police constantly, pleading for Robert Picton's investigation, and claiming he was responsible for the missing women. His calls were ignored by the police as annoying and obsessive. Fast forward to 2002. A former Picton farm employee who had a fight with Robert reported him to the police. He claimed to have seen a cache of illegal, unlicensed weapons in Robert's trailer on the property. Canadian police took weapons charges seriously, and this direct information about illegal firearms was enough to get a search warrant. They got the warrant to find illegal guns, not missing women. In February 2002, a large police task force raided the pig farm. The property was swarmed, secured, and Robert's messy trailer searched. They easily found the illegal guns, as the informant described inside. However, as they searched the cluttered rooms, they found several items linked to downtown East Side missing women. Identification cards, personal items, and clothing were found. Robert was arrested for weapons, but the legal system got him out on bail. However, the police knew they were onto something bigger. They kept Robert under close physical surveillance and forbade him from returning to the farm until they finished a thorough forensic search of the entire acreage. With specialized chemical sprays, forensic investigators searched Robert's trailer for blood during this massive, detailed farm search. Chemicals reacted in one room, revealing a lot of blood. The blood sample matched one of the downtown East Side missing women after DNA testing. With this forensic evidence of foul play, police acted immediately. After being arrested, Robert Picton was charged with murder. While Robert was in a secure jail cell awaiting trial, the police conducted a clever undercover operation. They imprisoned another man. Robert thought this man was another serious crime detainee waiting for his trial. Actually, this man was an experienced undercover police officer, and the entire cell was wired with hidden microphones and video cameras to record every word. During their time in the small cell, Robert relaxed. He bragged to the undercover officer about his dark secrets. Robert made shocking statements in these recorded conversations. He calmly confessed to his cellmate that he killed 49 people. He said these victims were most of the downtown East Side's missing women over the past decade. He even complained to the undercover officer that he had wanted 50 victims but got caught because he was sloppy at the end. The horrific timeline and methods of Robert's killing spree were revealed after a massive years-long investigation. After this confession, he started killing women in 1991. In 1996, he and his brother founded the Piggy Palace Good Time Society, which boosted his business. Parties were ideal hunting grounds. Robert used these large, crowded gatherings to lure his victims to his farm faster and less suspiciously. After a victim arrived on his farm, he led them away from the party and into his trailer. He would quickly trap, handcuff, and tell them it was over once inside. He would then execute them. His methods were cold and calculated. He would inject them with deadly automotive antifreeze or strangle them to death, making them silent. Robert waited until the farm was quiet and the partygoers left after the victim died. He moved the body from his trailer to the bloody slaughterhouse. He butchered humans like pigs using their farming equipment. He had a well-organized and disturbing corpse disposal system. The hungry pigs on the property ate a lot of his victims' body parts. Pigs ate almost everything, leaving little trace. Robert had an even more shocking disposal method for body parts he didn't feed to his pigs. He drove the remains to the downtown East Side rendering plant in barrels. This was the plant he had visited for years, just blocks from where he picked up the women. An industrial rendering plant crushes and cooks animal waste, carcasses, fat, and bone at high temperatures. Waste becomes refined gelatin. This gelatin is sold as a raw material and used to make cosmetics, lipsticks, gummy candy, and marshmallows. This meant that Robert's victims' microscopic remains ended up in consumer products sold to unsuspecting Americans. The horror continued. Robert sometimes saved the best human meat during the grueling butchering and disposal process. He ground this meat in his commercial grinders and mixed it with pork. He seasoned and made sausage. Robert served this homemade sausage to his massive Piggy Palace party guests. He casually gave packages of the meat to unsuspecting neighbors and donated boxes of sausage to local food banks and orphanages. People ate this meat without knowing its horrific origin. One of Canada's largest and most expensive forensic investigations was the Picton Farm search for physical evidence. Investigators in protective suits and masks spent months carefully sifting through over 300,000 cubic meters of soil and pig feces beneath the farm. To find tiny bone and dental fragments, they had to screen every bucket of dirt. Robert's highly effective body disposal methods made the search difficult. Investigators found only small pieces of 26 missing women's remains despite their massive efforts. After reviewing this physical evidence, the prosecution charged Robert Picton with 26 first-degree murders. However, the judge split the trial into two parts due to its complexity and amount of evidence. The first trial would focus on 6 cases with the strongest physical evidence. The jury heard weeks of horrific testimony about the farm, undercover jailhouse recordings, and forensic findings. The jury convicted Robert Picton of all 6 second-degree murder charges. Since he was convicted on these 6 counts and received the maximum sentence, the prosecution decided not to run the second trial for the remaining 20 counts, saving taxpayers millions of dollars. The harshest Canadian sentence at the time was life in prison without parole for 25 years for Robert Picton. He remains in prison, isolated. His brother and sister owned the land, and his brother ran the Piggy Palace Good Time Society and parties, but they were never charged with murder. No direct evidence showed that the siblings knew about Robert's horrific trailer and slaughterhouse crimes, investigators said. The case left a lasting mark on Port Coquitlam and downtown Eastside Vancouver. The victims' families struggled with grief and anger. They warned the police for years that a predator was targeting their daughters, sisters, and mothers, but they were ignored. Instead of dropping charges, the police could have saved dozens of lives by investigating Wendy's 1997 attack or the disappearances. The remaining 23 families whose loved ones were never tried, and the dozens of other families of missing women who suspect Robert of their disappearances, but whose remains were never recovered from the pig farm, still remain. They remain haunted by the details of what happened to the women they loved. The Piggy Palace story is a grim reminder of what happens when those sworn to protect them forget the most vulnerable. We must look back at the years before Robert's arrest, when authorities ignored multiple red flags, to understand how this tragedy could have been prevented. From initial reports of missing women to survivors' physical evidence, the system failed almost everywhere. Because of their struggles, downtown Eastside residents were silenced, while a killer operated publicly on a quiet farm 15 miles away. The farm showed how easy it was to hide a dark secret if no one was looking. The massive, isolated property was surrounded by thick trees and overgrowth. It appeared to passers-by as a failing agricultural operation where time had stopped while the city modernized. The brothers lived in rusted trailers with junked cars, appliances, and scrap metal. This cluttered landscape made it easy to hide evidence, as unusual items or activities could be explained away as farm clutter. Additionally, the pig farm's nature provided a perfect cover for the horrific activities there. Pigs are opportunistic feeders that will eat almost anything, so the property's large number of animals made organic material easy to dispose of. The constant smell of manure and animal waste also masked other odors that might have alarmed neighbors or visitors. A self-contained disposal system allowed Robert to commit crimes for over a decade without local authorities noticing. The Piggy Palace Good Time Society was crucial to these events. A charity that hosted dances and community events became a hub for illegal activity, attracting hundreds of marginalized people. The parties were held in the old slaughterhouse, which killed and processed animals. Robert was able to operate in an environment where meat hooks, concrete drainage troughs, and bloodstains were common. The drugs, alcohol, and chaos at these parties often distracted guests from noticing anything unusual. They came to the farm to escape their problems and use drugs without fear of arrest. The women who disappeared were often last seen at these parties, surrounded by people who were too impaired to remember who they were with or when they left, creating a perfect storm of vulnerability. The complex relationship between the Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Coquitlam Detachment hampered the disappearance investigation. The missing women disappeared from Vancouver, but the farm was in Port Coquitlam, so the case involved multiple jurisdictions. This prevented departments from communicating and coordinating, as each assumed the other was handling the situation. Information was lost, tips were not shared, and the investigation was uncoordinated until it was too late. A personal grievance-driven former employee provided the specific information about illegal weapons that allowed police to obtain a search warrant, turning the case around. The breakthrough was not from a dedicated homicide investigation, but from a routine firearms check, which is frustrating. Without that tip, the farm may never have been searched, and Robert Pickton may have continued his horrific activities for years. The post-raid farm forensic search was unprecedented. Every shovelful of soil was sifted through mesh screens after several feet of excavation. The largest forensic excavation in Canadian history took over a year and cost tens of millions of dollars. Anthropologists, entomologists, and DNA experts identified tiny human remains that survived the destruction process. The forensic team suffered greatly emotionally. They worked in mud, pig feces, and the property's grim reality for months. Since they found the missing women's jewelry, keys, and clothing, many workers needed counseling to cope with their discoveries. The items were a sad reminder of a life cut short and a tangible link to a loved one who had died. The legal proceedings were also complicated and tense. Much of the evidence was circumstantial or based on microscopic DNA fragments, making it difficult for the prosecution to present to a jury. To ensure a fair trial and prevent the jury from being overwhelmed, the charges were split, a controversial move that led to a conviction on the first 6 counts. The families of the other 20 women were frustrated by this decision because they felt their loved ones were not getting justice in a public courtroom. The small city of New Westminster hosted the trial, which garnered international media attention. Every day, journalists, legal experts, and victims' families filled the courtroom to learn how such a horrific series of crimes could have happened. The defense claimed Robert was a simple, easily manipulated man being scapegoated for others, but the forensic evidence and undercover recordings were insurmountable. The sentencing of Robert Pickton provided some closure, but also sparked a discussion about systemic failures and vulnerable populations. The British Columbia police response to missing women reports was heavily criticized by a public inquiry. Systemic bias, lack of resources, and poor communication contributed to the killer's escape, prompting calls for major reforms in missing persons cases. The Piggy Palace case still affects Canadian public policy and community activism. It stressed the need for better support for sex workers, drug users, and Indigenous women who are overrepresented among missing and murdered Canadians. Community groups in Vancouver's downtown east side continue to provide safe spaces, housing, and advocacy for those vulnerable to exploitation and violence. After reading this tragic story, we feel deeply for the victims and their families. Real people with dreams, struggles, and loving families. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends killed by a predator who exploited their vulnerability. The fight for justice, accountability, and social change ensures that their names are never forgotten and that such a tragedy never happens again. The Port Coquitlam farm has been cleared, the buildings demolished, and the land left vacant, but its history lives on. A dark, silent horror lurked behind a rural decay facade, reminding us that the most terrifying events can happen in the most unexpected places. The investigation's lessons shape forensic science and police procedures worldwide, serving as a grim example. Media coverage of the case is also debated. Initial coverage was sparse, reflecting societal indifference to the missing women. Only after family members, advocates, and a few dedicated journalists brought the story to national attention did the police and public face the truth. This media shift raised awareness and pressured authorities to act, showing the power of investigative journalism to expose systemic failures. Financial aspects of the case are also important. The brothers' sudden rise from failing farmers to millionaires shows how real estate development affects rural properties. The millions they made selling their land funded the destructive lifestyle and parties that allowed the crimes, not personal improvement. Tragically, their wealth enabled one of Canada's darkest chapters. Wendy, the farm escapee, is one of the most remarkable and terrifying parts of the story. She fought back, wounded her attacker, and escaped due to her bravery and quick thinking. It is tragic that her brave actions and clear testimony were not enough to secure justice at the time, but her survival and the evidence she provided helped bring the killer to justice. Her experience also exposes the justice system's deep flaws in treating non-perfect witnesses. The decision to dismiss her account based on her personal struggles highlights the prejudice vulnerable people face when seeking legal help. As advocacy groups advocate for a more compassionate, unbiased approach to supporting victims of violence, regardless of background or lifestyle, this lesson remains relevant. The undercover police officer who shared a cell with Robert helped convict him. To gain the trust of a suspected serial killer in a confined space requires immense psychological skill, and the operation recordings gave the jury direct, undeniable proof of Robert's guilt. His boastful confession in his own voice disproved any doubts about his involvement in the disappearances and revealed his cold, unfeeling crimes. His confession, especially his desire to kill 50 people, showed chilling calculation and remorse. He treated his victims like numbers in a grim tally, not people with lives and value. Hearing such offenders casually express their lack of empathy in the recordings was powerful and disturbing for everyone involved in the trial. The forensic search had a major environmental impact. To avoid contamination, hazardous waste and biohazards had to be managed during the excavation of such a large area. The site was secured, and specialized equipment processed soil and runoff water to ensure the search did not harm the local community. Environmental agencies, forensic experts, and local government collaborated on the massive logistical challenge. The pig farm site is now quiet and empty, a stark contrast to its past chaos and horror. Port Coquitlam residents see it as a haunting reminder of the community's loss of safety. Some want to build a memorial park to honor the victims, while others want to leave it as a quiet green space for nature to slowly reclaim the site of so much suffering. Annually, victims' families gather to remember and support each other. These rallies demonstrate the community's strength and resilience in refusing to let the killer's horrific actions define the women's memory. They celebrate their lives, personalities, and love to keep their spirits alive in a world that often forgot them. The case transformed evidence management, multi-jurisdictional investigations, and victim rights in Canada. Based on the systemic failures in Vancouver and Port Coquitlam, police training programs nationwide emphasize building trust with marginalized communities, taking missing persons reports seriously from the start, and preventing bias from impede justice. The entire story, from Robert Picton's quiet childhood on the isolated pig farm to the massive forensic search and dramatic courtroom trial, reminds us of justice's fragility and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable. This story asks us to examine our society, question how we value different lives, and make sure no one falls through the cracks of our collective care and protection. The memories of the 26 women whose remains were found and the many others still missing inspire action. Their stories demonstrate the human cost of indifference and the power of persistence against systemic obstacles. Daughters laughed, mothers cared, and sisters dreamed, and their lives had meaning and value that cannot be erased by death. While the case exposed deep divisions, the local community has worked to heal. New community policing initiatives and programs offer support to downtown Eastside residents to improve police-resident relations. Although there is still much to do, these initiatives are a step forward in ensuring that past mistakes are not repeated and that every community member is treated with dignity, respect, and care. The Piggy Palace Good Time Society's tragic tale of missed opportunities and deep grief is complex. However, it is also about survival, community, and truth-seeking. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable horror, there are always those who will fight for justice, speak for the voiceless, and bring the truth to light, no matter how long or difficult. As we close this chapter on one of the most disturbing cases in modern history, we carry the names and memories of the victims, the courage of the survivors, and the dedication of those who worked to bring a killer to justice. Their legacy inspires us to protect each other, fight injustice, and create a world where everyone is safe, valued, and remembered. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. In 1989, a 22-year-old named Eloise Lindsay set out on a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, hoping it would help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Instead, the trip would end with Eloise lost in the woods for nearly 3 weeks, convinced that something was following her through the trees. She had just graduated from college, a milestone that for many signals the start of a clear career path. But for Eloise, holding her degree felt less like a map and more like a blank page. She genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do next with her life. Being an experienced backpacker, she felt the call of the wilderness. She believed that a long, solitary journey through nature would give her the time and space she needed to think, to reflect, and to hopefully find some clarity. So she came up with a plan. When Eloise laid out this detailed plan for her parents, they weren't particularly concerned for her safety. They knew their daughter. They knew she was a capable and seasoned backpacker who had successfully completed similar trips before. They trusted her skills and her judgment. So, with their blessing, they wished her well and told her they'd see her when she got back. On November 4th, Eloise shouldered her pack and set out to begin her journey. The first couple of days were exactly what she had hoped for. The weather was beautiful, the autumn scenery along the trail was breathtaking, and the solitude was perfect. She had all the time in the world to be by herself, to look inward, and to think deeply about what her future might hold. But on the morning of the third day, everything changed. She woke up inside her tent, which she had pitched just off the trail the night before, and was immediately hit with an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling that she couldn't place. There was no obvious reason for it. She did a mental inventory, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had she forgotten a crucial piece of gear? Was there something about her route she was misremembering? But nothing came to mind. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just a strange mood. She decided the best thing to do was to get moving, to pack up her camp and start hiking. She figured the physical activity and the change of scenery would help clear her head. So she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cool morning air. As she began breaking down her campsite, she casually scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, it was just a natural habit for a hiker, and that's when she saw it. She could have sworn she saw the figure of a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. She blinked, doing a double take, and stared at the spot. It was broad daylight, and she was near a popular trail. The idea of seeing another person wasn't unbelievable in itself. But the way he was standing there, just watching, felt odd. When she looked again, the person was gone. She stood frozen for a minute, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen him. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Did she really see someone? If there was another hiker there, why were they hiding? Why wouldn't they just say hello? Out here in the relative wilderness, hikers usually acknowledged each other. But this person never showed themselves again. As she stood there trying to decide what to do, she felt a powerful, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. And it felt exactly like the sense of dread she had woken up with inside her tent. A chilling thought entered her mind. Was her intuition, her sixth sense, trying to warn her that she was being observed by a predator? She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the feeling was undeniable. Alone in the middle of the woods, even an experienced hiker like Eloise couldn't help but feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact that this man, if he was real, wouldn't show himself again made her feel threatened. The feeling quickly escalated into panic. She abandoned any attempt at being neat and orderly and started stuffing her gear into her pack as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking. As soon as her pack was on her back, she took off down the trail, walking quickly away from the campsite and the man she saw in the woods. As she hurried along the path, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind her. She kept whipping her head around, her heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But the trail behind her was always empty. Yet, that visceral feeling of being watched, that deep sense of dread, it just wouldn't go away. Her fast walk turned into a jog, and her jog turned into an all-out run. She realized she was in a very remote section of the trail, miles from any town or road. She was nowhere near her next planned stop. A new thought took hold of her. She had to get off this trail. She had to get to a road, to civilization, to safety, as quickly as humanly possible. She weighed her options. She could stay on the trail, but it would be many more miles and likely take her well into the night before she reached any kind of town. Or she could take a shortcut. She had a map, and she believed there was a road that ran parallel to the trail, but it was far down the mountain. Getting to it would mean leaving the marked path and bushwhacking through dense, unfamiliar wilderness. But the threat of the person or thing she felt was following her was so intense, so real to her, that she couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out in the woods being stalked. So she made a fateful decision. She stepped off the trail and started running straight down the steep, wooded mountainside. It wasn't long before she started to hear actual sounds coming from behind her. She was certain it was the person who was following her. She'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. She'd slow down, trying to listen as she walked, and she'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the leaves far behind her. Again, she'd turn and see nothing. But she was absolutely certain someone was back there stalking her. And then came a new sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a deep male voice, but it wasn't a language she could recognize. It was more like a grunt or a yell. Her heart rate soared. She was in full-blown panic now, crashing through the wilderness as fast as she could, praying she was headed towards the road. But after running for miles deep into the middle of nowhere, she hadn't found a road. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark. She knew she was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to make camp. She knew that somewhere out there in the blackness of the woods was the person or thing that was hunting her. She was all alone, with no way to call for help. This was 1989, long before everyone carried a cell phone. With trembling hands, she set up her tent, crawled inside, zipped it up, and lay there, listening, hoping for silence. But sure enough, within minutes, she started to hear those sounds again. The low, audible grunts from somewhere in the forest. And then, the sound of heavy footsteps, walking in a wide circle around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she heard it. The footsteps never came right up to her tent. There was always some distance, but they were always there. Finally, the sun came up. The moment there was enough light to see, she scrambled out of her tent, packed it up in a frenzy, and started running again, desperately hoping she was moving in the direction of civilization. And all through that day, the terrifying cycle repeated. She had the constant sense that someone was watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, but saw nothing when she turned. She heard that low grunting voice from somewhere in the trees, but could never see who or what was making the sound. As the sun began to set again, she still hadn't found the road. She hadn't found a trail. She knew she couldn't even try to backtrack. If she turned around, she was bound to run straight into the very thing she was trying to escape. So once again, she found a spot to set up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She got inside her tent, and just like the night before, as soon as she was lying down, she heard the heavy footsteps circling in the woods and the low, audible sound that she couldn't place. A couple of days later, the day Eloise was supposed to meet her friend at the 7-day mark, she never showed up. Her friend waited at the rendezvous point for several hours, growing more and more concerned. Finally, when it was clear Eloise wasn't coming, her friend left the trail, found a phone, and contacted the authorities to file a missing person report. The police immediately launched a massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she was supposed to be. For the next 14 days, hundreds of police officers, search and rescue volunteers, and helicopters scoured the area. But they found no sign of Eloise at all. After 2 full weeks of searching, the police had to make the difficult decision to call off the official search. 2 days after the search was terminated, which was now 23 days after Eloise had first set off on her hike, a hunter was out in a remote area near the trail. He stumbled upon Eloise propped up against a tree. She was totally emaciated, severely dehydrated, and delirious, but she was alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter. In her confused state, she thought he was the person who had been following her. But when she finally realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was taken to a hospital, and aside from her severe dehydration and malnourishment, she was physically okay. In multiple interviews and in her official police statement, she detailed her terrifying ordeal. She insisted that she had been chased for nearly 3 weeks through the woods and that she had no idea who it was or why they were chasing her. Then she added another bizarre detail. She said that right before she was found, this person or thing that was following her got so close to her on a couple of occasions that she became absolutely terrified. She was so scared that she made a desperate choice. She ditched her backpack. Her backpack contained all of her life-saving equipment, her tent, her sleeping bag, her food and water. She threw it all away so she could be lighter, so she could run faster. Tapas. You have to imagine the level of fear a person would have to be in to willingly abandon the one thing they need to survive in the wilderness. After ditching her pack with no supplies, no food, and no water, she stumbled across a tree in the middle of nowhere. And wedged inside a hollow in the trunk was a stash of donuts and pound cake. She took the food, and between that and water from a stream she found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before the hunter found her. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was just as baffled. Some believe she may have had a mental break, that she got lost, and her paranoia created an imaginary pursuer. Others, including some park rangers familiar with that part of the trail, believe it's possible she was stalked by so-called wild men, feral people who are said to live deep in the mountains, according to local legend. But as of today, there is no official explanation for what happened to Eloise Lindsay. On the 7th of June, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the McGees and the Crosses, decided to spend a beautiful day together. They met up at the Santa Fe ski basin for a picnic to enjoy the fresh mountain air. During the summer months, when there's no snow on the ground, the ski basin is a very popular spot for hikers. The terrain is rugged, and the views from the top are absolutely incredible. But on this particular day, the two families just wanted to have a relaxing picnic at the base of the mountain, looking up at the slopes. As the parents began unpacking the car and setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. There was Larry and Janet McGee, a brother and sister who were 7 and 5 years old, and their friend, 3-year-old Stephen Cross. After they had finished laying out the blanket and the food, the parents looked around and realized the kids were gone. They had just seen them playing nearby only a minute or two before, so they figured they couldn't have gone very far. They started looking around, calling out their names, but there was no answer. Their calls became a little more urgent as they began to worry. They expanded their search, looking farther and farther from the picnic spot. They realized the only place the children could have gone was up into the dense woods that bordered the area. But the terrain there was very steep and very rugged. It seemed impossible that 3 young children, one of them a toddler, could have gotten very far up the mountain. And they weren't responding to their parents' calls. A terrible thought began to creep in. Maybe they had been abducted. One of the parents ran to the main building of the ski resort where a staff member was on duty and used the phone to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they immediately set up huge, powerful spotlights and aimed them up at the mountain. The idea was that if the kids had somehow wandered up into the woods and gotten lost, they would see the bright lights and hopefully walk down towards them. After setting up the lights, the police began a thorough search of the mountainside, hoping that the children were simply lost and not the victims of a kidnapping. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers yelling out the children's names, they heard nothing back. They found no sign of the kids. They searched all through the night, and as the hours passed, the grim possibility of an abduction seemed more and more likely. By the following afternoon, things were really starting to look bleak. There was still no sign of the kids anywhere. That's when a searcher, who was way outside of the primary search area, made a startling discovery. He was about 3.5 miles away from the picnic site and thousands of feet up in elevation. He was getting ready to leave his assigned section when he saw something out of the corner of his eye that looked like a person. He turned and saw one of the children poking their head up from behind a large, downed log. The searcher ran over, and sure enough, all three kids were huddled together inside the hollow log. They were dirty and scared, but they were all okay. As the searcher was picking them up and radioing in the incredible news, he couldn't help but wonder how in the world these three little kids had managed to get so far away and so high up the mountain. Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters, reunited with their tearful parents, and checked over by a doctor who confirmed they were okay, the police asked them the question on everyone's mind, how did you get all the way up there? Larry, the oldest of the group at 7 years old, was the one who answered. It took him a minute, but eventually he said that they had been playing near the picnic area and had wandered just a little way into the tree line. All of a sudden, he said, a bear came out from behind a tree and started chasing them. According to Larry, the three of them ran for their lives 3.5 miles up a steep mountain until they found the log, which they jumped inside of to hide. He claimed the bear was patrolling the area looking for them. But then Larry added another detail. He said that in addition to the bear, they were especially scared of the gorilla that was also walking around the area looking for them too. Now, it's easy to dismiss a child's story. You could say the gorilla they saw was just one of the searchers. But there were no searchers in that specific remote area near the log until the exact moment they were found. It was a last-ditch effort to expand the search, and it was a miracle they were located at all. Larry insisted that he and the other kids saw the gorilla and the bear on the first day and during the first night, long before any search teams were that far up the mountain. As for the bear, sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin are rare, but not unheard of. However, if a real bear had been chasing three small children, it would have caught them. There's no way three kids, especially a 3-year-old, could outrun a bear going uphill. So either there wasn't a bear or it was some other animal that just looked like a bear to them. But even if you discount the animals entirely and say the kids just got lost, there's still the problem of the distance. To cover 3.5 miles uphill through extremely rugged mountain terrain is an incredible feat for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. For a 3-year-old, it's practically impossible to do in a 2-4-hour period without help. The only way it might be possible is if the children were in absolute fear for their lives. The adrenaline rush from that kind of terror could potentially give them the strength and endurance to cover that distance. This lends a strange credibility to their story that they were, in fact, running for their lives. But what were they running from? A bear? A gorilla? We'll likely never know. Because the children were found alive and safe, the case was closed and everyone moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was a force to be reckoned with in college football. He was arguably one of the most successful college quarterbacks in history, leading his team to 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also known for being one of the toughest players on the field. Most quarterbacks are trained to avoid big hits, to slide or run out of bounds. Not Cullen. He stood 6'2", weighed 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he actually wanted to get hit and that he would hit back. His coaches hated it, but his teammates loved his fearless, aggressive style. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. During his junior year in college, he broke his collarbone but didn't tell anyone. He played through an entire playoff series with the injury and still led his team to victory. After college, however, Cullen's professional football career didn't reach the same heights. He had brief stints with 2 NFL teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but he didn't get much playing time. He could see the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to make it in the NFL. So he left for Europe to play in the European Football League. But when that career also began to sputter out around 2009, he came back to the United States and joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. Cullen's passion for the game was still as strong as ever, but he knew that playing at this level meant his career was effectively over. Around the same time he was hanging up his football cleats for good, he met a woman named Jennifer who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player, and in many ways she was just as competitive and athletic as Cullen. They were a perfect match. They got married in 2010, and Cullen, this big, tough quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar. He was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. It was a huge turning point for him, a moment where he was consciously putting his football past behind him to start a new life and build a family. The newlyweds moved into a house in Michigan, had 2 children, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. By all accounts, Cullen was thriving in his life after football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family planned a 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan. Cullen and Jennifer decided to join them with their kids. They rented a cabin near the campsite where Jennifer's family was staying. The whole weekend was wonderful. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time fishing and relaxing. On May 26th, the last night of the trip, Cullen, who had recently bought a new pontoon boat that he was incredibly proud of, wanted to go out one last time. He just wanted to fish for another 30 or 45 minutes before they packed up and ended the weekend. So Cullen put on his fishing waders and his jacket, grabbed his fishing pole, and had his family drive him to the set of stairs that led down to the water where his boat was docked. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes. He told them to pick him up at the next boat ramp downriver and that he would call them when he was ready. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer's phone rang. It was Cullen. She expected him to say he was ready to be picked up. But when she answered, Cullen's voice was frantic. He told her that he was being followed by 2 men. He said he was out on the water in his pontoon boat, but there were 2 men in the tree line on the shore. He said he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, and they had been following him for some time. Before Jennifer could even process what he was saying and ask a question, Cullen said something incredibly strange. He told her he was going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. Then he hung up. Jennifer immediately tried calling him back over and over, but he didn't pick up. She was left feeling totally shocked and confused. What stood out most to her was the raw fear in his voice. Fear was not an emotion she associated with Cullen. This was a man who was a beast on the football field, who seemed fearless. For him to sound that scared and to be talking about people stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. She immediately called 911, described where he was on the Baldwin River, and the police said they would send someone out right away. After getting off the phone with the police, Jennifer called her family and told them about the bizarre and terrifying phone call from Cullen. Her brother, Matt, decided to try calling Cullen himself. This time, Cullen answered. Matt asked him, "Cullen, where are you?" Cullen replied, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." Matt tried to get more information, asking if he was still on his boat or if he was on land. All Cullen said was, "It's getting pretty rough out here," and then he hung up again. Matt called Jennifer and told her about the call, but it didn't provide any clarity. So Jennifer and her family decided the best thing to do was to drive to the boat ramp where Cullen had originally said he wanted to be picked up. They hoped he might somehow make his way there. When they arrived, Cullen was nowhere to be seen. They got out of their car and yelled his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Shortly after, a police car pulled up. This was one of the locations Jennifer had mentioned to the 911 operator. The police officer took an official statement from Jennifer, and at that point they filed an official missing person report for Cullen Finnerty. Before starting the physical search, the police contacted Cullen's wireless service provider and asked them to ping his cell phone. A service provider can roughly triangulate a phone's location based on which cell towers it's connecting to. The results they got back were bizarre. The last 4 locations that were pinged for Cullen's phone were up to 4 miles apart from each other. This was strange because the idea that Cullen could have covered that much ground, moving 4, 5, or even 7 miles in a short amount of time through very rugged wooded terrain, didn't seem possible. What was even stranger was that when police looked at these 4 points on a map, each one was either right next to a paved road or would have required him to cross a paved road to get there. If he was lost and scared, why would he keep crossing roads, which represented safety, and plunging back into the wilderness? As strange as the data was, it gave the police a solid starting point. They dispatched search teams to each of the 4 locations and also began combing the banks of the river where he was last seen. Within an hour, they found his boat. It was beached on the side of the river, a little ways downstream from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached or had just drifted ashore. Cullen was not in it, and a search of the immediate area found no sign of him. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the boat was found told police he heard screaming or yelling coming from that area around the same time Cullen went missing. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of volunteers searched the areas where his phone had pinged and along the river, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after he went missing, they found his body. He was located less than half a mile from a paved road in an area situated between the 4 cell phone ping locations. He was lying face down, his right arm tucked under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching a handful of grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming from his nose, but other than that, there was no sign of significant trauma anywhere on his body. He appeared to be fully clothed, but investigators noted that the strap on his waders was badly twisted. This was a significant detail. A twisted strap like that would have been very uncomfortable, something a person would almost certainly fix before starting a fishing trip. This, combined with the bizarre statement he made to his wife about taking his clothes off, led some to speculate that at some point during his ordeal, his clothes had come off and had been put back on again in a hurry, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone was found in his front pocket. Cullen's initial autopsy was inconclusive. There was no obvious cause of death. Later, a more detailed analysis determined he had died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. Many people believe Cullen's death was a tragic result of CTE, a brain injury caused by the years of repeated head trauma from playing football. CTE can lead to paranoia and confusion. Perhaps he had a severe paranoid episode, believed someone was chasing him, got lost and scared, and in his panicked state, somehow ended up dying. There was a minor incident in 2011 where Cullen had briefly thought someone was following him, but it had passed. But even if it was a fit of paranoia, why didn't he stop when he reached the paved roads? A road represents help and safety. His instinct should have been to seek help, not to run back into the woods. And why did he leave the safety of his boat in the first place? On the other hand, if he really was being followed, why would his pursuers allow him to make phone calls? Why would they prompt him to take his clothes off? It makes no sense. Both theories are full of holes, leaving a tragic and profound mystery. Thank you so much for watching. What makes stories like these so unsettling is that they don't feel impossible. Even today, people still disappear in forests, national parks, and remote wilderness areas under circumstances nobody can fully explain. And in all 3 of these cases, the victims described the exact same terrifying feeling that something was following them just beyond the trees. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe out in places where there are no cameras, no witnesses, and no help for miles around, there really was someone or something out there with them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next time you find yourself completely alone in the woods and suddenly get the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to trust that feeling.